Hello everyone, and welcome to this special deep dive where I get to play your personal guide through one of the most extraordinary cinematic experiences ever created. If you're sitting there wondering what movie could possibly combine heart-pounding action, jaw-dropping visuals, brain-twisting ideas, and performances that stay with you for weeks, then let me tell you right now, you need to watch Inception from 2010. I'm not just saying that because it's a blockbuster. I'm saying it because this film does something very few movies ever achieve. It respects your intelligence, dazzles your senses, and leaves you feeling like you've just woken up from the most vivid dream of your life. Yet you can't stop thinking about it. Whether you're a longtime fan of mind-bending stories or someone who simply loves great entertainment, Inception is the movie you've been waiting for. So grab a comfortable seat, maybe even a notebook if you want to jot down your thoughts afterward, because I'm about to walk you through every single fascinating detail that makes this film an absolute must-see. And don't worry, I won't spoil a single surprise. We're just going to explore why this movie deserves every bit of your time and attention. Let's begin with the visionary behind it all. Christopher Nolan. Born in London in 1970, Nolan has become one of the most respected directors working today, famous for crafting stories that play with time, memory, and perception in ways that feel both intimate and epic. Before Inception, he had already given us the groundbreaking low-budget thriller Memento in 2000, the stylish noir Insomnia in 2002, the superhero reinvention Batman Begins in 2005, the mind-bending magician rivalry The Prestige in 2006, and, of course, the record-shattering The Dark Knight in 2008. What sets Nolan apart is his insistence on practical filmmaking. He shoots on real film stock whenever possible, builds massive physical sets, and uses digital effects only when they truly enhance what the camera can capture in the real world. He co-writes many of his scripts with his brother Jonathan, but for Inception, he handled the screenplay entirely on his own, drawing from ideas he had been pondering since the early 2000s. After finishing Insomnia, he first pitched a treatment to Warner Brothers executives, an 80-page outline about people who could enter and manipulate dreams. The studio was intrigued, but Nolan knew the project was too ambitious for where he was in his career at that moment. So he set it aside, gained experience on bigger stages with Batman, and only returned to it after The Dark Knight's phenomenal success gave him the confidence and clout to demand the resources this story deserved. He spent roughly 6 months in 2009 polishing the final draft, but the roots of the idea stretch back nearly a decade of careful thought. Nolan has said in interviews that he wanted to create something more emotionally resonant than a simple heist picture. He wanted audiences to feel the weight of memory, regret, and the blurred line between what's real and what we construct in our minds. That personal investment shines through in every frame. The film was produced by Nolan and his wife and longtime collaborator Emma Thomas through their company Syncope, in partnership with Warner Brothers Pictures and Legendary Pictures. The official budget came in at a very substantial $160 million, which at the time made it one of the most expensive original screenplays ever greenlit without relying on an existing franchise. But every penny is visible on screen. Principal photography kicked off on June 19, 2009 in Tokyo, Japan, and wrapped on November 22, 2009 in Alberta, Canada, spanning just over 5 months, but covering 6 different countries. They filmed in bustling Tokyo streets, historic London locations, romantic Paris avenues, the winding Medina of Tangier in Morocco, sunny Los Angeles soundstages, and downtown freeways. And finally, the snowy peaks of Fortress Mountain in Canada. Nolan chose these real-world places deliberately to ground the more fantastical elements in authentic textures and lighting. One of the most famous practical builds was a 100-foot-long hotel corridor constructed inside a giant airship hangar in Cardington, Bedfordshire, England. The entire set could rotate a full 360 degrees on 8 massive concentric rings powered by electric motors, allowing actors to perform gravity-defying fights while the camera stayed level. Joseph Gordon-Levitt spent weeks rehearsing in this spinning structure, comparing it to training inside a giant hamster wheel. In Paris, they shot at real landmarks like the Bir Hakeim Bridge and the Musée Galliera, done using high-pressure nitrogen blasts instead of actual explosives for safety, while filming at ultra-high speeds with multiple cameras. In Los Angeles, a freight train crash sequence used a full-scale fiberglass replica mounted on a tractor-trailer chassis, with water cannons creating torrential rain. Even the climactic van sequence involved real stunt work with actors suspended underwater, using scuba tanks and buddy breathing systems for several minutes at a time. In Canada, the crew built elaborate mountain sets near a chairlift and waited patiently for the perfect snowstorm to capture the desired atmosphere. This commitment to practical filmmaking is why the action feels so visceral and believable. You can sense the weight, the physics, the danger. Visually, the film is a triumph thanks to cinematographer Wally Pfister, who shot on 35mm film and incorporated IMAX cameras for key sequences to deliver unmatched clarity and scale. About 18 minutes of the movie were captured in the giant IMAX format. Pfister's work earned him an Academy Award, and it remains one of the last major films to win Best Cinematography before the industry largely switched to digital. The editing by Lee Smith is equally masterful, weaving together multiple layers of reality with precision timing so the story never feels confusing despite its complexity. Sound design, supervised by Richard King and others, is so immersive that it won 2 Oscars on its own, Best Sound Editing and Best Sound Mixing, because every footstep, every distant echo, every swelling musical cue pulls you deeper into the experience. Now let's talk about the incredible cast that brings all of this to life. Leonardo DiCaprio leads as Dom Cobb, delivering one of the most layered, intense performances of his career. DiCaprio was Nolan's first and only choice for the role. The two had wanted to work together for years, and DiCaprio spent months discussing the script with Nolan to make sure the emotional core felt authentic. His portrayal is magnetic. You believe every moment of determination, doubt, and quiet pain. Joseph Gordon-Levitt plays Arthur, Cobb's dependable partner who manages the intricate details of their operations with calm precision and dry wit. Gordon-Levitt performed nearly all his own stunts, including those wild rotating corridor fights, and brings a cool professionalism that anchors the team. Elliot Page portrays Ariadne, the brilliant graduate student and architect who designs the dream environments with creativity and curiosity. Page was chosen for that perfect mix of intelligence, youth, and maturity, and serves as a wonderful entry point for the audience into this strange new world. Tom Hardy is Eames, the charming forger who can impersonate anyone with flair and humor. Hardy's performance crackles with charisma and unexpected warmth. Ken Watanabe appears as Saito, the powerful and enigmatic businessman who sets the entire mission in motion. Watanabe had previously worked with Nolan on Batman Begins, and Nolan actually wrote the role with him in mind. His presence adds gravitas and cultural depth. Marion Cotillard plays Mal with elegance, vulnerability, and haunting intensity, creating a character who lingers long after the film ends. Cillian Murphy is Robert Fisher, bringing subtle layers of conflict and humanity to a key figure in the story. Michael Caine, a Nolan regular, appears as Professor Stephen Miles, Cobb's wise mentor and father-in-law, offering calm guidance with his trademark warmth. Supporting roles are filled perfectly by Dileep Rao as the innovative chemist Yusuf, Tom Berenger as a trusted associate, Lucas Haas as an earlier architect, Tallulah Riley in a small but memorable cameo, and Pete Postlethwaite in one scene. Every single performer feels perfectly cast, and their chemistry makes the team dynamic feel lived in and believable. The visual effects team, led by Paul Franklin, kept things surprisingly restrained. Only around 500 VFX shots in the entire film, compared to the 2,000 or more common in other big blockbusters. But they built miniatures for certain large-scale destructions and blew them up practically, then enhanced them subtly. The famous Paris street folding sequence was pre-visualized with rough animations so actors could react to it on set before CGI completed the illusion. The dream cityscapes were designed to feel both beautiful and slightly unsettling, with artists drawing inspiration from modernist architecture and glacial forms. Nolan's philosophy was always make it real first, then enhance, and that approach pays off in spades. Hans Zimmer's score is another reason this movie lives rent-free in so many heads. Zimmer began composing while filming was still happening, creating a dense, electronic, yet deeply emotional soundscape filled with nostalgia and urgency. The famous Brahm horn motif became instantly iconic and influenced countless trailers afterward. Tracks like Time build to an unforgettable crescendo that perfectly mirrors the film's themes of ticking clocks and fading moments. Zimmer even incorporated elements of Edith Piaf's classic Je ne regrette rien as a clever narrative device for measuring dream time. The soundtrack album dropped on July 11, 2010, and the Blu-ray edition included a high-resolution 5.1 surround mix that still sounds incredible today. Zimmer received an Oscar nomination for Best Original Score, and the music stands as one of his finest achievements. Inception premiered on July 8, 2010, at the Odeon Leicester Square in London, with the full worldwide release hitting theaters on July 16. Warner Brothers poured more than $100 million into marketing, and running one of the smartest viral campaigns in history. There was a mysterious website featuring an animated spinning top, an online game called Mindcrime, QR codes on promotional t-shirts that linked to a fake PASIV device manual, hidden trailers, and bizarre teaser images sent to magazines. The official trailer dropped in May 2010 and went mega viral, spawning fan mashups and endless discussion. The film opened on about 3,792 regular screens plus 195 IMAX screens in North America, earning $62.7 million in its first weekend, including strong midnight shows, and held the #1 spot for 3 straight weeks despite its 148-minute runtime. It eventually grossed roughly $292 million domestically and between $544 and $578 million internationally for a worldwide total of around $836 to $839 million, making it the 4th highest grossing film of 2010 and proving that original intelligent blockbusters could still dominate the box office. Strong markets included China, the UK, France, Japan, and South Korea. It was re-released in IMAX for its 10th anniversary in August 2020, giving a new generation the chance to see it on the biggest screens possible. Critics went wild. Rotten Tomatoes shows an 87% fresh rating from over 360 reviews, with an average score of 8.4 out of 10. The consensus calls it smart, innovative, and thrilling, that rare summer blockbuster that succeeds viscerally as well as intellectually. Metacritic landed at a solid 74 out of 100. Roger Ebert gave it 4 stars and called it a breathtaking juggling act. Peter Travers at Rolling Stone described it as a wildly ingenious chess game. Empire magazine awarded 5 stars, comparing it to Stanley Kubrick directing a William Gibson story. It topped dozens of year-end lists, appeared on more than 270 critics' top 10 roundups, and over the years has been ranked among the greatest films of the 21st century by outlets like the New York Times, BBC, and Total Film. Audiences agreed, giving it a B+ cinema score and proving it played equally well to casual viewers and die-hard cinephiles. At awards season, Inception walked away with 4 Oscars at the 83rd Academy Awards: Best Cinematography for Wally Pfister, Best Sound Editing, Best Sound Mixing, and Best Visual Effects. It was also nominated for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Original Screenplay, Best Art Direction, and Best Original Score. It won BAFTAs for Best Production Design, Best Special Visual Effects, and Best Sound, plus the Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation and the Bradbury Award. The Saturn Awards honored it as Best Science Fiction Film, with additional wins for direction, writing, and effects. In 2025, the United States Library of Congress selected it for the National Film Registry, recognizing its lasting cultural, historic, and aesthetic significance. The legacy of Inception is enormous. It popularized the idea that big-budget movies could still be wildly original. The term Inception and the suffix "ception" entered everyday language for anything with layers upon layers. Philosophers, psychologists, and film students still analyze its themes of reality, subconscious influence, and creative collaboration. Nolan has revealed that he structured the main team's roles like a real film crew. Cobb as the director with the grand vision, Arthur as the producer keeping everything organized, Ariadne as the production designer building the worlds, Eames as the actor who transforms into anyone, Saito as the demanding studio executive, and the target as the audience itself. That meta layer makes the movie even more fascinating on repeat viewings. Fans love spotting tiny background details that reward careful attention. The home media release in December 2010 on DVD and Blu-ray sold millions of copies, and earned over $160 million in revenue by 2018. There was even an ultra-limited collector's edition packaged inside a metal passive briefcase replica, complete with a spinning top prop. Those sold out in a single weekend. Later, 4 KUHD editions and the Christopher Nolan collection keep the film looking pristine for modern screens. Deleted scenes, behind-the-scenes documentaries, and Nolan's commentary track offer even more insight for enthusiasts. So why should you watch Inception right this moment? Not because it's pure cinematic magic. It's a film that trusts you to keep up, rewards multiple viewings, looks and sounds better than almost anything released since, and features a cast and crew operating at the absolute peak of their powers. In an age of endless sequels and safe remakes, Inception stands tall as a reminder that Hollywood can still take bold swings and connect with audiences on a profound level. It will make your pulse race during the action, your mind race during the quieter moments, and your heart feel something real in between. Whether you watch it alone with headphones for the full immersive score, with friends so you can debate every detail afterward, or on the biggest screen you can find for the IMAX experience, you will walk away energized, inspired, and maybe even a little changed. This is the kind of movie that reminds us why we fell in love with films in the first place. The thrill of discovering new worlds, the joy of masterful storytelling, and the lingering wonder that stays with you long after the lights come up. If you're just joining, pull up a chair because we're diving even deeper into why Inception from 2010 remains one of the most captivating, intelligent, and flat-out thrilling movies ever made. Last time, I walked you through the director, the cast, the insane practical effects, the budget, the locations, the score, the box office triumph, the awards sweep, and that enduring legacy that keeps people coming back years later. But there's so much more to uncover. Fascinating trivia, clever little production secrets, and those behind-the-scenes stories that make you appreciate Christopher Nolan's genius even more. I'm your narrator here, and I'm excited to keep guiding you through this cinematic dream world without spoiling a single moment of the plot. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you'll be itching to hit play and experience it all over again. Let's keep going. One of the coolest things about Inception is how Nolan turned the entire heist team into a clever metaphor for how movies are actually made. He explained this himself in interviews. He saw Cobb as the director. I'm the one with the overall vision who's constantly wrestling with personal demons while trying to bring everything together. Arthur is the producer, the organized point man who handles logistics, keeps the schedule tight, and makes sure nothing falls apart. Ariadne, the brilliant young architect, stands in for the production designer, crafting entire worlds from scratch with imagination and precision. Eames, the forger who slips into different identities so effortlessly, represents the actor who transforms completely for the role. Saito, the powerful figure funding the whole operation and setting high expectations, is like the studio executive breathing down everyone's neck. And the target? Well, that's us, the audience, being drawn in, manipulated just enough to feel the full emotional impact. Nolan has said he drew from his own experiences in filmmaking to create this layered team dynamic. It's a subtle but brilliant way the movie comments on creativity itself, making every rewatch feel like peeling back another level of meaning. Speaking of levels, the film's commitment to practical effects is legendary, and it goes way beyond what most people realize. Take that iconic rotating hotel corridor fight scene. Yes, they built a massive, fully functional set that spun 360 degrees using giant hydraulic rings inside a converted airship hangar in Cardington, England. Joseph Gordon-Levitt trained for weeks to handle the disorientation, doing most of his own stunts while the whole thing rotated around him like a giant washing machine. The crew timed everything perfectly so the camera could stay level while gravity flipped wildly. It wasn't green screen magic. It was real physics, real sweat, and real risk. Similarly, the zero-gravity hotel hallway sequences used wires, harnesses, and clever choreography rather than heavy CGI. Nolan's special effects supervisor, Chris Corbould, and his team made sure the actors felt the weightlessness authentically. Even the massive avalanche in the snowy fortress was achieved with practical snow machines, explosives for triggers, and carefully controlled chaos on location in Alberta. The production designer, Guy Hendricks Dias, worked hand-in-hand with Nolan to design dream worlds that felt tangible. curved architecture inspired by impossible Penrose stairs, folding city streets that started as practical miniatures before subtle enhancements. In total, the film used only about 500 visual effects shots, insanely low for a movie of this scale, where most blockbusters hit 2,000 or more. That restraint is why everything feels so grounded and immersive. Filming spanned 6 countries, and each location added its own flavor. It kicked off in Tokyo with helicopter shots over the glittering skyline, real choppers, real city lights. Paris was magical. They shot on the Pont de Bir Hakeim Bridge, used air cannons for controlled explosions instead of real pyrotechnics, and captured those folding street scenes with a mix of practical sets and precise pre-visualization so the actors could react naturally. Tangier in Morocco brought exotic, winding Medina streets for tense chases. Los Angeles handled soundstage work plus that unforgettable freight train sequence, where they built a full-scale train prop on a moving rig with massive water effects for rain. And the snowy climax? Fortress Mountain in Kananaskis Country, Alberta, Canada. Real blizzards, real altitude, real endurance from the cast and crew waiting days for the perfect storm. Principal photography wrapped right on schedule on November 22, 2009, after starting June 19th, proof of Nolan's meticulous planning. The cast choices were spot on, and many stories highlight how collaborative it was. Leonardo DiCaprio wasn't just handed the role. Nolan had admired his work for years and built the entire ensemble around him to create a youthful, energetic contrast that kept the story dynamic. Joseph Gordon-Levitt pushed his body to the limit in that spinning set, earning praise for his commitment. Tom Hardy brought improvisational flair to Eames, by adding humor and charm that lightens intense moments. Marion Cotillard delivered a performance so powerful it lingers emotionally without ever overshadowing the ensemble. Elliot Page brought fresh curiosity and intellect to Ariadne, serving as our guide into this bizarre universe. Ken Watanabe added quiet intensity and cultural authenticity to Saito. Cillian Murphy layered vulnerability into his role beautifully. Even smaller parts, like Michael Caine's warm, paternal mentor or Dileep Rao's innovative chemist, feel perfectly lived in. The chemistry among them makes the high-stakes teamwork believable and fun to watch. Hans Zimmer's score deserves its own spotlight. He composed while filming was underway, syncing themes to the script's emotional beats. That deep, rumbling Bram sound became a cultural phenomenon, instantly recognizable in trailers everywhere. He cleverly wove slowed-down elements of Edith Piaf's Non, Je ne regrette rien into the soundtrack as a time dilation cue, subtle, genius, and perfectly thematic. The final track, Time, builds so gradually yet powerfully that it still gives chills. Zimmer earned an Oscar nod, and the album remains a favorite for fans who want to relive the atmosphere at home. Marketing was next-level smart. Warner Brothers spent over $100 million promoting it, launching viral campaigns with mysterious websites, spinning top animations, fake corporate documents, and a mind-bending online game called Mindcrime. Trailers dropped strategically, building hype without revealing too much. It opened huge, $62.7 million domestic in its first weekend on nearly 4,000 screens plus IMAX, and held #1 for weeks despite competition. Worldwide, it crossed $839 million, making it the 4th highest-grossing film of 2010. It proved original. Cerebral blockbusters could still crush it at the box office. Awards poured in. Beyond the 4 Oscars, for cinematography, sound editing, sound mixing, and visual effects, it grabbed nominations for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Original Screenplay, Best Art Direction, and Best Original Score. It swept BAFTAs in production design, visual effects, and sound, won the Hugo for dramatic presentation, and earned Saturn Awards as Best Science Fiction Film. In 2025, the Library of Congress added it to the National Film Registry, cementing its status as culturally and historically significant, right up there with classics that shape cinema. Trivia keeps surprising people even now. Nolan considered 3D, but ditched it because the tech felt too limiting for his storytelling. He even tested post-conversion, but decided against it to preserve quality. The script evolved from an 80-page treatment Nolan wrote after Insomnia in 2002, shelved until he had the experience from Batman films to tackle it properly. He finished the screenplay after years of refining, especially nailing the emotional heart. Some early casting rumors floated names like Brad Pitt or Will Smith for Cobb, but once DiCaprio signed on, everything clicked. The film's runtime is a tight 148 minutes, yet it never drags. Every scene propels the story forward. The home video releases were collector gold. The Blu-ray included Nolan's commentary, making-of featurettes showing the rotating set in action, and high-res audio mixes. A super limited edition came in a metal passive briefcase with a real spinning top prop, sold out instantly. 4K versions keep it looking stunning today. 15 years on, Inception still sparks debates, inspires artists, and reminds us cinema can be bold, beautiful, and brainy all at once. It's influenced everything from memes to philosophy discussions to how filmmakers approach dreams and reality. The phrase, "a dream within a dream," took on new life because of this movie. So if you've made it this far, you know the truth. Inception isn't just a film. It's an experience that challenges you, thrills you, and stays with you. Watch it for the first time and feel your mind expand. Rewatch it and catch new details every single viewing. Share it with friends and argue over your favorite layers. This is the movie that proves big ideas can still win big at the box office and in our hearts. We've already covered the director's journey, the epic cast, the groundbreaking practical effects, the locations across 6 countries, Hans Zimmer's unforgettable score, the massive box office success, the Oscar wins, and that cultural legacy that keeps growing. Now, let's peel back even more layers with some of the most intriguing behind-the-scenes secrets, clever production choices, and fascinating little details that make this film feel even more special. Remember, I'm keeping everything spoiler-free so you can discover the magic fresh or rediscover it with new eyes. Let's dive deeper into what makes Inception such a one-of-a-kind experience. One thing that always blows people away is how Christopher Nolan approached the entire project like a personal evolution. He first dreamed up the core concept around 2001, right after finishing Insomnia, sketching out an 80-page treatment about dream stealers and lucid dreaming. Warner Brothers loved the pitch, but Nolan felt he wasn't ready. He wanted more experience handling massive action, complex narratives, and emotional depth. So he set it aside, directed Batman Begins, The Prestige, and The Dark Knight, learning invaluable lessons along the way. By the time he returned to it in 2009, after The Dark Knight's billion-dollar success gave him real leverage, he had grown into the story. He spent months refining the script, and focusing especially on making the central character's journey emotionally resonant rather than just a clever puzzle. In interviews, he said the emotional core, with themes of loss, guilt, and moving forward, only clicked once he connected it to something deeply personal. That long gestation period is why the film feels so polished and layered. It's the product of nearly a decade of thoughtful development. Another gem is how Nolan deliberately modeled the heist team after a real film crew. He drew from his own experiences on set. The leader with the vision is like the director. The organized point person handling details is the producer. The world builder, crafting impossible environments, is the production designer. The shapeshifter slipping into roles is the actor. The high-powered backer with big expectations is the studio executive. And the one being drawn into the story is the audience itself. Nolan has confirmed this in multiple interviews, saying he wrote, "The team-based creative process, he knows best." It's a subtle meta-commentary that adds extra depth every time you watch. You start seeing filmmaking parallels everywhere, making the movie feel like it's winking at how stories get made. Production trivia keeps getting more impressive the deeper you go. Nolan shot the entire film himself without a second unit director, a rarity in big Hollywood movies, meaning he personally oversaw every shot, from quiet character moments to massive set pieces. That hands-on approach ensured consistent vision and quality. Visual effects were kept minimal at around 500 shots total, far fewer than most blockbusters of that era, which often hit 2,000 or more. Instead, the team relied on practical builds, explosions in real Paris cafes using controlled pyrotechnics and air cannons for safety, full-scale train props crashing through streets, and that legendary rotating corridor constructed on hydraulic rings so actors could perform in genuine disorientation. Joseph Gordon-Levitt described rehearsing in it as training in a giant hamster wheel, and he did nearly all his own stunts to capture authentic physicality. The Paris folding street sequence started with practical miniatures and pre-visualization, so actors could react to something tangible before digital polish. The zero-gravity hotel fights used wires, harnesses, and clever camera work rather than heavy CGI. Even the snowy fortress avalanche involved real snow machines, controlled blasts, and waiting for perfect weather on location. And these choices make the impossible feel weighty and real. You feel the physics, the danger, the effort. Casting stories add extra flavor too. Leonardo DiCaprio was Nolan's top choice from the start, and they spent weeks in pre-production dissecting the script together, turning what could have been a cold intellectual exercise into a deeply human story. Early rumors swirled about other big names for the lead role, but once DiCaprio committed, the chemistry locked in. Tom Hardy improvised some of Eames's charm and wit, bringing unexpected levity. Marion Cotillard's performance carried such emotional weight that it influenced how Nolan handled certain themes. Even Michael Caine in his mentor role got clear guidance from Nolan about which scenes were grounded in one reality versus another. Details like that helped the cast stay anchored amid the mind-bending rules. The marketing campaign was brilliantly mysterious, building hype without over-explaining. Viral sites with spinning animations, fake documents, QR codes on shirts linking to classified manuals, and an online game called Mindcrime all teased the concept of planting ideas. Trailers dropped at perfect moments, sparking endless online discussion. It paid off hugely. The film opened strong and held the top spot for weeks against heavy competition. Over the years, fans have kept the conversation alive with clever observations and details that reward rewatches. Things like color palettes shifting subtly between layers, and architectural inspirations from real, impossible objects like Penrose Stairs, or how certain sounds echo across scenes to signal transitions. Nolan has spoken about deliberately leaving room for interpretation, especially in how he frames ambiguity, not as confusion, but as emotional freedom. He wants viewers to focus on what the characters feel rather than pinning down every rule. That openness is part of why people return again and again. Each viewing reveals something new, whether it's a background detail, a line delivery, or a thematic echo. Home releases added even more value. The Blu-ray and later 4K editions include Nolan's full commentary track, where he breaks down choices like practical versus digital, the score's integration, and why certain cuts heighten tension. Featurettes show the rotating set in action, the team building massive practical props, and interviews revealing how the cast trained for the physical demands. Collector editions packaged in replica briefcases with actual spinning props became instant rarities. 15 years on, Inception continues to inspire. Philosophers discuss its ideas about consciousness, filmmakers study its structure, and casual viewers just get lost in the thrill. It's influenced everything from memes to how stories play with perception. The film's confidence in trusting the audience to keep up, combined with its visual spectacle and heartfelt core, makes it timeless. So if you're still on the fence, or if it's been a while since your last viewing, do yourself a favor. Dive back in. Watch for the craftsmanship, the performances, the way every element serves the bigger picture. You'll walk away exhilarated, thoughtful, and probably planning your next rewatch already. We've talked about the director's long road to making it, the cast chemistry, the jaw-dropping practical stunts, the score that haunts your dreams, the box office dominance, the awards glory, and those clever meta layers that mirror real filmmaking. Now, let's uncover even fresher angles, some origin stories from Nolan himself, influences that shape the vision, subtle production quirks, and those mind-expanding little insights that make every viewing feel like unlocking a new secret. As always, no plot reveals here, just pure appreciation for what makes this film a timeless thrill ride. Settle in. We're going deeper. Christopher Nolan has shared in interviews that the spark for Inception goes way back to his teenage years. Around age 16, he started pondering the nature of dreams and how they can feel utterly convincing while you're inside them. He experimented with controlling his own dreams, those rare moments of lucid awareness where you realize you're dreaming and try to bend the rules. He described those attempts as frustratingly elusive, but when he succeeded even a little, it felt like wielding a superpower. That personal thrill of dream manipulation became the foundation. Years later, while at university, he'd pull all-nighters and drag himself to free college breakfasts the next morning. using those half-asleep states to play with dream control. Those real-life experiments fed directly into the film's core idea. What if you could share and shape dreams deliberately, like a heist crew pulling off the impossible? The script itself took a full decade to perfect. Nolan first drafted an early version around 2001, right after Insomnia, but he knew it needed more emotional weight to avoid feeling like just a clever gimmick. He set it aside to build his skills on bigger canvases, returning only after The Dark Knight proved he could handle epic scope and deep character work. The breakthrough came when he tied the high-concept premise to genuine human stakes: loss, regret, redemption, making it resonate on a personal level rather than staying purely intellectual. In one candid talk with James Cameron, Nolan explained how those early lucid dream experiments inspired the film's rules about time dilation, shared consciousness, and the blurred edge between dream and reality. It's no wonder the movie feels so authentic. It's rooted in the director's own subconscious explorations. Influences poured in from everywhere. Nolan has name-dropped films like The Matrix, Dark City, and The 13th Floor, stories that question whether the world around you is truly real. He also drew from classic cinema: Ridley Scott's atmospheric worlds, James Bond's slick espionage, the original Star Wars sense of wonder, even old Charles and Ray Eames documentaries featuring spinning tops as symbols of balance and perception. Mythology played a role too. Ariadne's name comes straight from Greek legend, the woman who guided Theseus through the labyrinth with thread, mirroring how the architect character navigates and designs dream mazes. Nolan even considered turning the whole thing into a horror story at one point, leaning into the terror of being trapped in your own mind. No, but he ultimately chose the heist thriller vibe to keep the energy adventurous and exhilarating. One quirky detail from production: Nolan shot the entire film without a second unit director, personally overseeing every frame. That's rare in massive blockbusters, but it guaranteed his singular vision stayed intact, from intimate close-ups to citywide spectacles. He tested shooting in 3D, but ultimately passed, believing the tech would limit creative freedom and complicate the storytelling. He even experimented with post-conversion, but ditched it when the quality didn't match what he wanted. Instead, he stuck to 35mm film and IMAX for those breathtaking sequences, creating a look that's crisp, tangible, and immersive in a way digital-heavy films sometimes lose. Color and lighting choices were meticulous too. Each dream level got its own distinct palette and atmosphere: rain-soaked streets, shadowy interiors, blinding snow, so even in quick cuts, your eye instantly knows which layer you're in. Practical explosions rocked real Paris cafes with actors right in the middle, using controlled blasts and air cannons for safety and realism. The zero-gravity fights relied on wires and harnesses choreographed precisely, giving Joseph Gordon-Levitt that authentic floating struggle. These grounded techniques make the surreal feel believable. You sense the effort, the danger, the physics bending just enough to thrill without breaking immersion. The acronym fans love spotting. Take the first letters of the main team's roles: Cobb, Arthur, Robert, Ariadne, Eames, Yusuf, Sato, and they spell out something intriguing when arranged thoughtfully, hinting at the layered structure. Little touches like that reward eagle-eyed viewers. Nolan has said he left plenty of room for personal interpretation, especially around perception and reality. So, the film invites you to project your own experiences onto it. That's why debates rage on for years. It's designed to spark thought rather than dictate answers. Even the soundtrack ties in cleverly. That iconic slowed-down use of Edith Piaf's "Non, je ne regrette rien" isn't random. Its original length mirrors the film's runtime in a poetic nod to time stretching and folding. Zimmer layered those echoes to heighten the disorientation and emotional pull. 15+ years later, Inception keeps inspiring. It's in the National Film Registry now, recognized for shaping culture, history, and aesthetics. Artists, thinkers, and everyday fans still dissect its ideas about consciousness, creativity, and letting go. It proved original stories with big brains and bigger risks can conquer the world. If this journey has you reaching for the remote again, go for it. Watch for Nolan's personal fingerprints, the practical wizardry, the influences woven in seamlessly. You'll feel that rush of discovery all over again, the kind only the best films deliver. We've journeyed through Christopher Nolan's decade-long obsession with the project, The way he wove his own teenage experiments in lucid dreaming into the very DNA of the story. The meticulous influences from everything between Greek mythology and classic sci-fi paranoia films. The decision to shoot without a second unit so every frame carried his unmistakable signature. The deliberate rejection of 3D technology to preserve creative control and visual purity. The carefully assigned color palettes and lighting schemes that whisper which dream layer you're inhabiting even before a single line of dialogue lands. And those tiny, almost invisible production choices, like the slowed-down echoes of Edith Piaf's anthem, threading through Hans Zimmer's score like a heartbeat stretched across impossible distances, that reward anyone willing to listen closely. Now let's push even further into territory that rarely gets the spotlight. The philosophical undercurrents Nolan quietly embedded, the way the film quietly interrogates our relationship with memory and identity, the subtle craftsmanship in sound design that makes silence as terrifying as any explosion, and why, 15 years later, this movie continues to feel like it was made yesterday while simultaneously belonging to some timeless future we haven't quite reached yet. At its deepest level, Inception isn't really about stealing secrets or planting ideas, though those mechanics are thrillingly precise and elegantly explained. It's about the stories we tell ourselves when the lights go out, the ones we cling to because letting go feels like erasure. Nolan has spoken in scattered interviews about how grief and guilt can construct entire inner architectures, labyrinths so convincing that the person trapped inside mistakes them for home. The film asks, without ever preaching, what happens when those private fortresses start to crack, when the mind's defenses turn against the very person they were built to protect. It's a question that hits harder the older you get. Worse, because most of us eventually carry versions of those same invisible rooms filled with echoes we can't quite silence. The movie never judges its characters for building those places. Instead, it watches with a kind of tender curiosity as they try to navigate back to daylight. That emotional patience, rare in a summer tentpole loaded with collapsing cities and spinning corridors, is what elevates Inception from clever puzzle box to something closer to quiet tragedy wrapped in spectacle. You feel the weight of every choice, every hesitation, every glance that lingers a half-second too long, and those small human moments become the real anchors holding the whole towering dream together. Sound plays a bigger role in selling that intimacy than most people notice on first watch. Richard King's Oscar-winning sound design team didn't just layer explosions and whooshing debris. They sculpted silence, reverb tails that stretch unnaturally in certain environments, the way footsteps suddenly lose definition when you're slipping between levels, the muffled underwater thump of a heartbeat that syncs perfectly with Zimmer's bass pulses. Those choices aren't accidental. They're designed to make your own body feel the disorientation the characters are experiencing. Your breathing might unconsciously slow when the audio drops to near nothingness, or speed up when distant sirens bleed into the score like they're coming from inside your skull. It's somatic filmmaking. The movie doesn't just show you a dream collapsing, it makes your nervous system register the collapse too. And combine that with Wally Pfister's cinematography, those long, unbroken takes in rain-lashed streets, the way IMAX frames swallow you whole during the mountain sequences, and you start to understand why Nolan insisted on shooting on celluloid. Film grain has a texture that digital often lacks. It feels alive, imperfect, human, just like the memories the characters are fighting to preserve or escape. Another layer worth savoring is how deliberately Nolan paces the reveals. He never dumps exposition in clumsy monologues. Instead, he lets rules emerge organically through action and necessity. You learn how dream time stretches not because someone stops to lecture, but because a character glances at a clock and panic flickers across their face. You grasp the danger of totems not through a PowerPoint slide, but through quiet, and almost reverent close-ups of fingers spinning small objects on tabletops. That restraint builds trust. You're never talked down to, never spoon-fed. So when the story accelerates into its final act, the momentum feels earned rather than manufactured. It's the difference between being led by the hand and being invited to run alongside someone who believes you can keep up. That faith in the audience is rare, especially in a film budgeted at $160 million. Yet it's exactly why Inception still stands apart from so many of its imitators. It respects your intelligence without ever making you feel like you're being tested. Visually, too, the dream worlds avoid the obvious neon and glitch cliches that became trendy after this movie's success. Nolan and production designer Guy Hendricks Dias drew from brutalist architecture, itchy mid-century modernism, glacial ice fields, and the impossible geometries of M.C. Escher to create environments that feel both majestic and faintly wrong. A city folding over itself isn't cartoonish, it's elegant, almost balletic, like a building deciding to remember its own construction in reverse. Snow doesn't just fall, it hangs in the air like suspended regret. Rain doesn't drench, it sheathes everything in a cold, reflective membrane that turns every surface into a mirror of distorted memory. These aren't random aesthetics, they're visual metaphors for how the subconscious rearranges reality when it's under pressure. The more you look, the more you realize every set piece is serving double duty. Spectacle on the surface, symbolism underneath. And then there's the simple, stubborn fact that Inception refuses to age. I rewatch it in 2026, and the practical effects still look more convincing than most current CGI-heavy blockbusters. The performances, DiCaprio's tightly coiled intensity, Gordon-Levitt's wry precision, Hardy's effortless swagger, Cotillard's heartbreaking elegance, feel as fresh as if they were shot last month. The questions it raises about reality, manipulation, free will, and the cost of holding on to the past haven't dated at all. If anything, they've grown more urgent in an era when deepfakes blur truth and algorithms quietly shape what we dream about next. The movie predicted a world where ideas could be weaponized and implanted without anyone noticing. Yet, it never feels like a warning screen. It feels like a mirror held up to our own minds, asking us gently what we're willing to believe and what we're willing to let go. So here we are, still talking about a film that came out when most smartphones had physical keyboards and streaming was barely a word people used. Yet it endures because it touches something primal, the terror and the beauty of waking up inside your own head and realizing the view might never be the same again. If you've been putting off a rewatch, or if you've only seen it once on a small screen with distractions buzzing around you, give it another chance under better conditions. Headphones, dark room, no phone nearby. Let the sound wrap around you. Let the images fill your peripheral vision. Let the story remind you why cinema can still feel like the closest thing we have to shared dreaming. We've lingered over the personal origins in Nolan's lucid dream experiments as a teenager, the slow burn evolution of the script across a full decade, and the philosophical quiet at the movie's heart about grief constructing private prisons of memory. The way sound design creeps under your skin with deliberate silences and echoing heartbeats. The restrained color grading that signals dream layers before words ever need to. The refusal of 3D in favor of celluloid's living texture. And how every architectural flourish, from folding boulevards to glacial fortresses, carries metaphorical weight about the mind's architecture under strain. Now let's venture into fresher corners. The way the film quietly subverts the heist genre's usual moral clarity. The understated role of physical objects as emotional lifelines, the deliberate rhythm of editing that mirrors the elasticity of dream logic, the global cultural echoes that have rippled outward since release, and why. In an age saturated with quick-cut spectacle and algorithmic predictability, this movie's patient confidence continues to feel almost revolutionary. What makes Inception so quietly subversive within the heist framework is how it refuses to let cleverness become the only virtue. Traditional heist stories often celebrate the plan's elegance, the team's slick competence, the thrill of outsmarting systems, and they usually end with the protagonists walking away richer and unpunished, or at least romantically justified. Nolan, however, turns the mechanism inward. The real theft isn't from an external vault, but from the self, and the real risk isn't capture by authorities, but permanent exile inside one's own constructed illusions. The film never glamorizes the act of intrusion. It shows it as invasive, intimate, and potentially irreversible, and forcing every character to confront whether the ends can ever truly justify the psychic violence of rewriting someone else's inner world. That moral ambiguity isn't preached. It's lived through furrowed brows, trembling hands, and silences that stretch longer than they should. By the time the story reaches its crescendo, you're no longer rooting for a clean getaway. You're invested in whether fractured people can find their way back to something resembling wholeness. It's a heist movie that ultimately cares more about healing than winning, and that inversion gives the entire genre a gentle, lasting shake. Objects in Inception function almost like talismans, small physical anchors tethering characters to whatever version of reality they most need to believe in. These aren't flashy MacGuffins designed to drive plot. They're quiet, worn, impersonal things. A child's hand reaching out in memory, a spinning piece of metal that refuses easy answers, a wedding ring that appears and disappears depending on who's looking. Nolan shoots them in extreme close-up, letting light catch every scratch and imperfection, turning mundane items into vessels of enormous emotional cargo. The camera lingers not because the objects are mysterious in themselves, but because they carry the residue of lives interrupted, promises broken, moments that refuse to fade. In a film full of collapsing cities and impossible geometries, these tiny, tactile details become the most grounding elements, proof that even in dreams engineered for deception, the body remembers what the mind tries to rewrite. It's a reminder that cinema at its best can make the ordinary sacred. And Inception does this so subtly that you might not notice until a second or third viewing, when suddenly those objects feel like the only stable things in a universe that's constantly folding in on itself. The editing rhythm deserves its own paragraph because it is, in many ways, the film's secret engine. Lee Smith's cuts don't just move the story forward, they mimic the way dreams compress and expand time. A single glance can stretch across what feels like minutes, while a frantic chase collapses into seconds. Transitions between layers aren't always marked by obvious wipes or dissolves. Sometimes they're hidden in the rhythm of breathing, the cadence of footsteps, or the way light shifts from warm to cold in the middle of a sentence. This creates a sensation of permeability, reality leaking into dream, a dream bleeding back into reality, without ever relying on cheap visual tricks like blurring edges or dreamlike filters. The pace accelerates not through shorter shots, but through mounting emotional density. Conversations that start calm grow frantic, silences grow heavier, music swells in waves that match the character's rising desperation. By the final sequences, the editing has trained you to feel time dilation in your own pulse. So when the story finally asks you to decide what counts as waking up, your body is already primed to question the boundary. It's masterful sleight of hand disguised as straightforward storytelling. Globally, Inception landed differently in different cultures, and those variations are fascinating to trace. And in Japan, it resonated deeply with audiences already steeped in dream narrative traditions from anime and literature. Think of films like Paprika or novels exploring subconscious invasion, and it became one of the highest-grossing non-franchise imports of its year there. In France, critics and viewers latched onto the romantic tragedy threaded through the spectacle, drawing parallels to classic poetic cinema about lost love and memory. In India, where multiplex crowds were just beginning to embrace cerebral Hollywood imports, the film sparked long post-screening debates in cafes about karma, illusion, and the nature of Maya, with many seeing echoes of ancient philosophical ideas in its layered realities. China embraced the visual grandeur and the high-stakes corporate intrigue, turning it into a sleeper hit that played for months. These diverse readings prove the film's universality. It doesn't impose a single worldview, but offers a structure flexible enough to hold whatever cultural lens you bring to it, which is why it still travels so well across borders and generations. And perhaps the most enduring miracle is how Inception has aged backward. In 2010, it felt audaciously ambitious. In 2026, it feels almost quaintly sincere. Amid today's landscape of franchise fatigue, nostalgia bait, and content engineered for maximum shareability, a movie that dares to run 148 minutes trusts you to follow 4 nested timelines without handholding, and ends not with a quip or a setup for sequels, but with an open, contemplative image seems almost defiant. It reminds us that blockbuster filmmaking can still be an act of faith. Faith that audiences want to think, feel, and question rather than just consume. Nolan bet everything on that faith, and the film keeps paying dividends because it never panders, never winks, never apologizes for asking you to meet it halfway. If you're reading this and realizing it's been too long since you last let those folding streets and spinning corridors wash over you, carve out the time. Watch it big if you can, quiet if you must, alone or with someone you trust to sit in the ambiguity with you afterward. Let it remind you that the best stories don't just entertain, they quietly rearrange the furniture inside your head long after the credits roll. We've already traced the film's roots in Nolan's adolescent fascination with lucid dreaming, the script's laborious 10-year gestation as he wrestled to infuse intellectual mechanics with genuine emotional resonance, the subversive twist on heist morality where the greatest theft is from the psyche itself and victory means release rather than riches, the way everyday objects become profound emotional anchors carrying the weight of interrupted lives and unspoken regrets, the editing's elastic mimicry of dreamtime compression and expansion that trains your own sense of duration, the diverse cultural receptions from Japan's affinity for subconscious narratives to France's embrace of its romantic melancholy to India's philosophical parallels with concepts of illusion and karma, and the stubborn refusal to age in an era of fleeting spectacle where patient, ambitious storytelling now feels almost radical. Let's venture even further now into territories that feel freshly illuminated in recent years, the persistent philosophical undercurrents that echo ancient questions about perception and authenticity, the subtle ways trauma manifests through dream logic and unconscious projection, the film's quiet commentary on guilt as an existential rather than merely moral burden, the global legacy that has only deepened with time, including its 2025 induction into the National Film Registry, and those microscopic visual and auditory cues that keep rewarding obsessive rewatches long after the initial wow factor has settled. One of the most profound philosophical threads running beneath the surface is how Inception engages with centuries-old debates about distinguishing waking life from illusion, unechoing Descartes' dream argument where certainty collapses if any experience could be dreamed. Yet Nolan doesn't offer easy skepticism or tidy resolutions. Instead, he probes what happens when the boundary erodes not through doubt, but through deliberate intrusion, when ideas take root so seamlessly that they feel native to the mind. The film asks whether true authenticity can survive such manipulation. Can a self remain whole if its deepest convictions were once foreign seeds? This isn't abstract musing. It's dramatized through characters who must confront whether their regrets, attachments, and senses of self are organic or engineered, forcing a reckoning with existential guilt that transcends simple wrongdoing. Guilt here isn't just about past actions against others. It's the heavier, internal weight of having constructed a reality that imprisons rather than liberates, a burden that demands confrontation with one's own being in the world rather than external atonement. By framing this through shared dreaming, Nolan turns a sci-fi premise into a mirror for how we all sometimes trap ourselves in self-narratives we can't or won't question, making the movie feel less like entertainment and more like a gentle, insistent invitation to examine the stories we live inside. Trauma weaves through these layers in ways that feel almost therapeutic in their subtlety. The unconscious isn't portrayed as a chaotic Freudian ID, but as a landscape shaped by unresolved loss, where projections of the past patrol like guardians gone rogue, defending fragile constructs against unwelcome change. Nolan draws from dream theory to show how the mind, in its deepest states, slows time not arbitrarily, but to process what waking life rushes past. Grief stretched across decades in subjective hours, memories replayed with cinematic fidelity, yet distorted by emotion. The film's use of architectural mazes and collapsing structures visualizes how trauma builds defensive labyrinths, beautiful, intricate, but ultimately isolating. Healing, then, isn't erasure but navigation, learning to dismantle walls without destroying the self they protected. This psychological realism grounds the spectacle. The chases and zero-gravity fights become metaphors for fleeing inner demons, while quieter moments of doubt and connection hint at paths toward integration. It's why the movie resonates so enduringly with viewers who've carried their own unresolved echoes. It doesn't diagnose or prescribe, but it acknowledges that the mind's architecture can be both prison and sanctuary, and that escape often requires trusting others to help map the way out. In the 15-plus years since release, Inception's cultural footprint has only expanded, evolving from viral Brahm memes and Inception suffixes into something more substantial. Its 2025 addition to the United States National Film Registry, alongside classics like The Thing and Clueless, cemented its status as culturally, historically, and aesthetically vital, recognized for influencing how we talk about perception in an age of digital manipulation and AI-generated realities. Recent discussions in 2025 and 2026 highlight its prescience. Ideas implanted subtly mirror algorithmic nudges on social feeds, shared dream tech prefigures, virtual reality immersion, and the film's refusal to confirm easy answers feels refreshingly honest amid polarized certainties. Personal essays from fans describe life-altering rewatches, some crediting it with sparking interest in philosophy or psychology, others seeing parallels to grief recovery or creative collaboration. The movie's open-ended invitation to interpret has kept conversations alive across generations, proving that true impact isn't measured in box office weekends, but in how long a story lingers in collective consciousness. And then there are those tiny, almost obsessive details that surface on deeper dives. How license plates in certain sequences carry cryptic tags like the alternate state, hinting at parallel possibilities, the way character names carry etymological weight, Ariadne evoking the mythic guide through labyrinths, Cobb phonetically echoing words for dream in other languages, subtle shifts in wardrobe or props that signal shifts in perception without fanfare, even the runtime's poetic alignment with the length of its key musical cue, turning the entire experience into a looped echo of its themes. These aren't accidents. They're Nolan's signature commitment to craftsmanship, where every frame can hold meaning if you're patient enough to look. They turn passive viewing into active discovery, ensuring that no two screenings feel identical. What keeps pulling people back, ultimately, is the film's rare blend of intellectual rigor and emotional vulnerability. It challenges the brain while quietly tending to the heart, asking big questions about reality, guilt, loss, and forgiveness without ever losing sight of the human cost. In a cinematic landscape often chasing novelty or nostalgia, Inception stands as proof that bold originality can endure, that trusting an audience to think and feel deeply can create something timeless. If this extended reflection has stirred something in you, perhaps a memory of your first viewing, a new angle on a scene, or simply the urge to experience it fresh, honor that impulse. Find a quiet evening, dim the lights, and let the layers unfold again. You'll likely emerge changed, just a little, in the best possible way. We've already delved into the philosophical echoes of Descartes' and ancient skepticism about distinguishing dream from waking life, the portrayal of trauma as defensive architecture that both shelters and confines the psyche, the existential weight of guilt reframed not as moral debt but as self-imposed exile from authenticity, the film's prescience in anticipating algorithmic idea planting and immersive digital realities, its 2025 National Film Registry induction as proof of lasting cultural resonance, and those obsessive micro-details, license plates carrying hidden state illusions, name etymologies nodding to mythic guides, wardrobe shifts signaling perceptual drift, that turn every rewatch into a treasure hunt for meaning. Let's press onward now into still untapped dimensions. The movie's understated meditation on collaboration as the antidote to isolation, the way it quietly critiques the commodification of the subconscious in a capitalist framework, the rhythmic interplay between spectacle and stillness that gives the film its unique breathing room, the enduring influence on contemporary storytelling across mediums from video games to virtual reality experiences, and why, amid today's relentless content churn, Inception's refusal to provide closure or definitive answers feels like an act of radical generosity toward the viewer. Collaboration sits at the very core of the film's mechanics and its deeper message in ways that often go unnoticed on first viewing. The heist cannot succeed through solitary genius. It demands a fragile trust among people with wildly different skill sets. Visionary architect, meticulous organizer, charismatic impersonator, chemical innovator, corporate financier, each bringing something the others lack, each vulnerable to the flaws the others must compensate for. Nolan presents this interdependence not as corporate team-building fluff, but as a profound human necessity. No mind, however brilliant, can fully map its own labyrinth without external perspectives. The character's success hinges on moments of genuine vulnerability, admitting fear, sharing grief, allowing someone else to see the cracks in their constructed reality, making the film, at its heart, a story about how connection pierces isolation. This theme resonates especially in creative fields where solitary artists often romanticize the lone genius myth. But Inception quietly insists that true creation, like true healing, is communal, requiring others to hold space for the parts of us we cannot yet face alone. It's a hopeful counterpoint to the film's darker explorations of entrapment, suggesting that while the mind can build impenetrable fortresses, it can also, with trust, dismantle them brick by brick. Another layer worth lingering on is how the movie subtly critiques the commodification of the subconscious under late capitalism. The entire premise revolves around turning dreams into a service industry, extraction for corporate espionage, inception for market dominance, where the most intimate human space becomes just another resource to exploit. Saito's empire isn't villainized in cartoonish terms. It's presented as the logical endpoint of a system that already treats attention, emotion, and imagination as monetizable assets. The passive device itself functions like a high-end piece of tech sold to the highest bidder, echoing real-world anxieties about data harvesting, targeted advertising, and the privatization of inner life. Yet Nolan never descends into didactic sermon. He lets the implications emerge through character choices and consequences, asking viewers to consider what price we're willing to pay when the line between personal reverie and corporate product blurs. In 2026, with neural interfaces inching closer to reality and AI models trained on our collective dreams, social media posts, search histories, private messages, the film's warning feels less speculative and more prophetic, yet it never loses its elegance or its faith in individual agency to resist such encroachment. Nor the film's rhythm. Its deliberate alternation between breathless action and prolonged, almost meditative stillness creates a breathing pattern rare in modern blockbusters. Explosive sequences of pursuit, collapse, and impossible physics are counterbalanced by long, unbroken takes of characters simply existing in silence, watching a totem spin, staring at rain-streaked windows, holding a photograph that trembles in their hand. These pauses aren't filler. They're where the emotional stakes accumulate, where grief and doubt are allowed to settle without interruption. Nolan understands that tension isn't sustained only through speed but through contrast. After chaos, quiet becomes deafening. After noise, silence roars. This push-pull mirrors the way real dreams oscillate between frantic narrative and suspended wordless emotion. They're training the audience to feel the elasticity of consciousness itself. The result is a movie that doesn't just entertain but physiologically affects you. Your own breathing may sync with the characters, your pulse quicken in the lulls as much as in the chases, making the experience somatic rather than merely cerebral. Its influence has spread far beyond traditional cinema into interactive and immersive mediums that didn't fully exist when it was released. Video game designers have cited Inception as inspiration for layered narrative structures in titles exploring memory and identity, games where players navigate shifting realities, question their own agency, or confront projections of guilt. Virtual reality developers point to its folding cities and zero-gravity corridors as blueprints for spatial storytelling that breaks Euclidean rules without losing emotional grounding. Even AI-driven art and generative storytelling tools occasionally echo its themes of planted ideas and recursive creation, though rarely with the same human tenderness. The film's DNA appears in music videos, experimental theater, and philosophical podcasts that use its framework to discuss consciousness, free will, and the ethics of mental influence. This cross-medium pollination proves Inception wasn't just a movie. It was a conceptual architecture flexible enough to host new forms of expression while retaining its original emotional integrity. And perhaps the greatest gift it offers in our current moment is its refusal to spoon-feed certainty. In an era where algorithms reward instant takes, definitive hot opinions, and closure-driven narratives, Inception ends not with a bow but with an image that invites endless interpretation. It trusts you to sit with ambiguity, to carry the question home, to let it simmer rather than resolve. That trust feels almost subversive now, generous in a way that says the viewer's mind is capable of holding complexity without needing to conquer it. It's a quiet rebellion against reductionism, a reminder that some experiences are richer when left open-ended, when the final spin isn't explained away but felt in the chest long after the screen fades to black. If these reflections have rekindled your curiosity or deepened your affection for the film, act on it. Revisit Inception when the world feels loudest. Let its silences speak, its structures unfold, but its questions linger. You'll likely find it hasn't just aged well, it's grown more necessary with time. We've already unpacked so many of its richest veins: the collaborative trust that becomes the film's quiet salvation against solitude, the sharp but never shrill critique of turning the subconscious into another extractable commodity, the deliberate breathing rhythm of spectacle and silence that lets emotional weight accumulate in the spaces between action, the sprawling influence on games, VR, and generative storytelling that treat layered consciousness as playable architecture, and the generous refusal of tidy closure that now reads like an almost defiant act of respect toward the viewer's own interpretive capacity. Let's move forward now into territories that feel especially alive in our present moment. The film's prescient modeling of how grief can hijack perception and rewrite personal history in real time. The understated power of nonverbal communication that carries more narrative freight than dialogue ever could. The way Nolan uses scale, both microscopic and cosmic, to mirror the mind's simultaneous smallness and boundlessness. The lingering ethical questions around consent in shared mental spaces that echo today's debates over data privacy and neural tech. And why the movie's final, suspended image remains one of the most quietly revolutionary endings in blockbuster history. An invitation, rather than a declaration that continues to ripple outward through culture and personal reflection. Grief in Inception isn't background color or convenient motivation. It is the active, shaping force that warps reality from the inside out. Nolan shows how unresolved loss doesn't simply linger. It colonizes the architecture of the mind, building corridors that lead nowhere, populating them with projections that look like loved ones but behave like wardens. Time in these spaces stretches because the grieving self needs more of it to replay, revise, and sometimes punish the past. What feels like minutes in the dream can equate to years of subjective torment. The film never pathologizes this process. It presents it as a natural, if destructive, attempt at preservation. What makes the portrayal so piercing is how grief hijacks not just memory, but perception itself. Colors mute, physics bend to accommodate longing. Familiar faces appear in places they never belonged. Healing, when it arrives at all, comes not from erasing those distortions, but from slowly allowing the external world, other people, shared reality, the stubborn insistence of the present, to intrude again. It's a depiction of mourning that feels almost documentary in its accuracy, drawn perhaps from Nolan's own reflections on loss, and it gives the high-concept machinery an ache that no amount of visual spectacle can outrun. The result is a film that can make even the most jaded viewer feel seen in their private, unspoken sorrow. Nonverbal storytelling carries an extraordinary portion of the emotional load here, often more than the script's carefully measured lines. So much is conveyed through posture, the way shoulders drop when hope flickers out, the fractional hesitation before touching an object that might confirm or shatter a fragile belief, the slow turn of a head toward a sound that shouldn't exist in this place. Hands become recurring motifs, reaching, clenching, spinning, cradling photographs, brushing against faces in gestures that say forgiveness or farewell without a single word spoken. Nolan and his actors trust these micro-movements to do heavy lifting. A glance held half a second too long can communicate decades of regret. A finger tracing the edge of a wedding band can hold an entire unspoken history. Dialogue, when it arrives, often feels like punctuation rather than the main sentence. The real conversation happens in the spaces between words, in the rhythm of breathing that sinks or stutters, in the way bodies orbit one another without quite touching. This restraint turns silence into its own language, one the film teaches you fluently over its runtime, so that by the end you're reading entire arcs in the tilt of a chin or the faltering spin of a small metal object. Scale operates on two simultaneous registers that give the movie its dizzying yet intimate feel. On one hand, the dream worlds explode outward, cities fold like origami, oceans rise in hotel corridors, mountains swallow entire fortresses, creating a sense of cosmic vastness that dwarfs the individual. On the other, the camera repeatedly returns to the miniature, the slow rotation of a totem on a cafe table, the close-up of raindrops sliding down glass, the tremble in a hand holding a faded photograph. By this oscillation between the infinite and the infinitesimal mirrors how the mind itself works, capable of containing universes of memory while being undone by the smallest, most ordinary detail. A child's laugh echoing in an empty room, the exact weight of a ring on a finger. Nolan uses these contrasting scales not for cheap awe, but to remind us that the grandest cataclysms of the subconscious often originate in the tiniest, most personal wounds. The result is a film that feels simultaneously epic and chamber-sized, a blockbuster that never forgets it is telling the story of one man's interior life. The ethical horizon around consent in shared mental spaces grows sharper with every passing year. On the film's premise, entering another's dream to extract or implant raises questions that now feel urgent. What does meaningful agreement look like when the mind is the territory being crossed? How do you ensure someone isn't subtly rewritten without their full, uncoerced awareness? Nolan doesn't resolve these dilemmas with easy moral verdicts. He lets them hang, forcing characters, and us, to grapple with the power imbalance inherent in any act of mental access. In 2026, as conversations about brain-computer interfaces, neuromarketing, and AI persuasion accelerate, those questions no longer feel speculative. The movie quietly insists that any technology capable of reaching inside thought carries an obligation to protect autonomy above all else. Yet it also acknowledges how grief, desperation, or ambition can erode that principle in practice. It's a moral landscape drawn without preaching, leaving space for the viewer to weigh the cost of crossing those lines. And then there is that final image, one of the most discussed, debated, and quietly beloved endings in modern cinema. Rather than delivering certainty, Nolan offers suspension, an object in motion, a cut to black, an invitation to decide for yourself what matters most. The choice to end on ambiguity isn't coy or evasive. It's an act of profound trust. It says the story isn't complete until you finish it in your own mind. That meaning isn't imposed, but co-created between filmmaker and audience. In an age where so much entertainment rushes to tie every thread, this refusal to resolve feels liberating, almost tender. It acknowledges that life itself rarely provides clean answers, that some questions are meant to spin on indefinitely, and that sitting with uncertainty can be its own kind of peace. If these thoughts have stirred something in you, perhaps a longing to revisit a particular silence, a gesture, or that suspended final frame, listen to it. Make the time. Let Inception remind you once more that the most powerful stories don't end on the screen. They continue turning quietly inside you long after the lights return. We've already traced so many of its luminous threads. Grief as an active, reshaping force that colonizes perception and stretches subjective time into private eternities. The eloquence of nonverbal gestures, tilted heads, trembling fingers, hesitant reaches, that speak volumes where words would only approximate. The masterful play of scale that juxtaposes cosmic dream cataclysms with the intimate tremor of a single photograph, the urgent ethical horizon around consent when minds become shared territory in an age racing toward neural interfaces and algorithmic suggestion, and that suspended final image, whose refusal to conclude remains one of the most courageous acts of trust a blockbuster has ever extended to its audience. Let's carry forward now into spaces that feel freshly resonant in our current cultural weather. The film's subtle portrait of how identity fractures and reforms under the pressure of imposed ideas. The way it uses water as a recurring elemental metaphor for emotional submersion and fragile resurfacing. The deliberate choreography of light and shadow that turns every interior into a psychological landscape. The quiet rebellion against narrative predictability that has kept the movie from ever feeling dated, and the personal, almost confessional way it invites each viewer to confront their own version of the central question: what are we willing to risk losing in order to feel whole again? Identity in Inception is never a fixed possession. It's a fragile negotiation constantly threatened by external suggestion and internal erosion. Nolan shows how a single planted idea, if deep enough, can rewrite not just beliefs, but the very sense of who one is. Suddenly the self feels foreign. Decisions that once felt authentic now carry the faint aftertaste of someone else's authorship. The film doesn't treat this as mere sci-fi gimmickry. It presents it as an existential crisis with real human stakes. Characters grapple with the terror of waking up one day and realizing their core convictions might have been imported, their memories selectively edited, their motivations subtly redirected. Yet, the movie never reduces identity to something purely malleable or illusory. It insists there remains a stubborn, irreducible core, felt in the body, registered in small physical habits, carried in the way someone instinctively reaches for a familiar object that resists complete overwrite. Reformation then becomes an act of reclamation, sifting through the layers, distinguishing native impulse from foreign seed, rebuilding a self that feels earned rather than engineered. This portrayal lands with particular force today, when social media, targeted content, and echo chambers quietly shape how millions understand themselves. Inception offers a mirror that is both unnerving and strangely consoling, reminding us that even when influence runs deep, the work of reclaiming authenticity is never truly impossible. Water appears throughout the film not as mere scenery, but as a persistent, almost elemental metaphor for the state of being emotionally submerged. Rain sheathes entire cities in reflective veils, turning streets into mirrors of distorted memory. Hotel corridors flood with impossible torrents that defy gravity yet feel inescapably real. Characters repeatedly find themselves breathing underwater, lungs burning, reaching for surface that keeps receding. These moments visualize the sensation of drowning in one's own feelings, grief, guilt, longing, where every attempt to break free only pulls you deeper until someone else extends a hand or a lifeline. Yet water also carries the promise of resurfacing. The slow rise from submersion, the gasp of air, the way light refracts differently once you're no longer beneath the surface. Nolan uses these aquatic motifs to chart emotional arcs without ever spelling them out. Rain as the weight of unresolved sorrow, flooding as the moment denial breaks, emergence as tentative return to shared reality. The metaphor is never forced. It flows naturally through the imagery, letting the element itself do the emotional heavy lifting so dialogue doesn't have to. Light and shadow function almost as characters in their own right, sculpting every interior into a living map of the psyche. Warm, golden hues often signal fragile moments of connection or memory that still hold some tenderness. Colder, bluish tones dominate when isolation or deception tightens its grip. Shadows pool in corners of rooms like unexamined regrets, lengthen across faces during confessions, or stretch unnaturally in dream spaces where logic has already begun to fray. Nolan and cinematographer Wally Pfister choreographed these shifts with surgical precision. Light slicing through blinds and sharp bars during interrogations, soft diffusion in moments of quiet intimacy, sudden flares when a projection turns hostile. The interplay isn't decorative, it externalizes internal states so viscerally that you feel the temperature change on screen. A face half in shadow can convey a mind half lost to illusion. A sudden beam catching an eye can signal the first crack of recognition. This mastery of lighting turns architecture into mood, space into feeling, making every frame a psychological event rather than just a visual one. The quiet rebellion against narrative predictability is perhaps what has kept Inception feeling perpetually contemporary. Most blockbusters of its era, and many since, lean toward escalating spectacle, clear moral binaries, and endings that tie off every thread for maximum catharsis. Nolan instead builds tension through restraint. Rules are revealed gradually through necessity rather than exposition dumps. Character motivations deepen rather than simplify. And the climax arrives not as a fireworks display, but as a series of intimate, almost domestic reckonings. The film trusts silence, trusts duration, trusts the audience to tolerate uncertainty rather than rushing to resolve it. In doing so, it carves out breathing room in a genre that often suffocates under its own momentum. That restraint now reads as quietly radical, an assertion that intelligence and emotion can coexist at blockbuster scale without compromise, that viewers deserve stories that challenge rather than comfort, and that true satisfaction sometimes lies in carrying a question rather than receiving an answer. At its deepest register, Inception keeps returning us to one piercing personal inquiry. What are we willing to risk? Certainty, safety, even pieces of ourselves, in order to feel whole again? The characters' journeys aren't about winning a heist or outsmarting a system. They're about deciding whether the cost of staying locked inside a comforting illusion outweighs the terror of stepping back into a reality that might never feel entirely solid. And the film never judges the impulse to hide. It simply asks what happens when hiding becomes permanent, and what courage it takes to choose exposure instead. That question lingers long after the screen goes dark because it isn't abstract. It's intimate, lived, universal. We all have versions of the labyrinth, versions of the totem we spin to reassure ourselves, versions of the people we can't quite let go. Inception doesn't solve that for us. It sits with us in it, gently insisting that the work of facing ourselves is worth every disorienting step. If these thoughts have quietly shifted something inside you, if they've made a familiar scene feel new, or reminded you of your own small anchors, honor that stirring. Find the time, dim the room, and let the film meet you where you are right now. You'll likely discover it hasn't just endured. It's grown more necessary, more companionable, with every passing year. We've already wandered through so many of its luminous corridors. Identity as a delicate negotiation, constantly under quiet siege from planted suggestions and internal erosion. Water as the recurring elemental language of emotional drowning and tentative resurfacing. Light and shadow, choreographed into a living psychological terrain where every beam or pool of darkness maps an inner state. The gentle defiance of predictable storytelling that keeps the movie feeling perpetually fresh in an era of formulaic catharsis. And that central, piercing personal question: what pieces of ourselves are we prepared to risk in order to step back into something resembling wholeness? Let's drift now into regions that feel especially tender and timely. The film's understated reverence for memory as both fragile archive and dangerous curator. The way it portrays forgiveness not as grand absolution, but as incremental acts of letting go. The subtle deployment of music as emotional scaffolding that supports without ever overpowering the human voice. The quiet dignity it grants to failure and hesitation as essential parts of any meaningful journey, and how the entire experience ultimately functions as a kind of secular meditation on impermanence, inviting us to sit with the discomfort of things slipping away without demanding we pretend the loss doesn't hurt. Memory in Inception is never a neutral storage room. It's portrayed as an active, sometimes treacherous curator that edits, embellishes, and occasionally fabricates in the service of emotional survival. Nolan shows how the mind doesn't merely recall, it reconstructs, smoothing rough edges, amplifying certain details while dimming others, all to keep the story of the self coherent enough to endure another day. Yet the film never treats this as deceitful or weak. It presents memory's unreliability as a deeply human adaptation, a way of carrying unbearable weight without breaking entirely. The danger arises when memory stops serving the present and begins to replace it, when the curated version feels safer, more complete, more alive than the imperfect reality outside. The character's struggle isn't to recover perfect recall, but to allow memory to coexist with the present rather than supplant it, to let the past inform without dictating. This portrayal carries a gentle compassion. It understands why we cling to edited versions of what was, why we sometimes prefer the echo to the silence that follows, and it asks only that we notice when the archive has become a cage. In doing so, the movie offers a quiet balm for anyone who has ever caught themselves rewriting history to make the present more bearable. Forgiveness, when it appears, arrives not as thunderous revelation or dramatic confrontation, but as small, almost imperceptible shifts. A hand unclenching, a gaze softening, a decision to stop replaying the same accusation in the mind's private theater. Nolan refuses to romanticize it as a single heroic act. Instead, he shows it as incremental, uneven, sometimes reversible work. Main characters forgive not because they have forgotten the hurt, but because they have begun to see that carrying the grudge is costing more than the original wound ever did. The film grants this process dignity by refusing to rush it. There are no sweeping speeches declaring absolution, no tidy reconciliations scored with swelling strings. Forgiveness here is quiet permission to lay down a burden, to let someone else's actions stop defining your own worth, to step out of the role of perpetual judge or judged. It's portrayed as exhausting, imperfect, and profoundly freeing all at once, a reminder that real mercy often looks ordinary. A shared silence, a small gesture, a choice to walk forward together even when the path still feels uneven. Music in Inception functions less as emotional wallpaper and more as structural scaffolding, supportive, inessential, yet always in service to the human moment rather than overshadowing it. Hans Zimmer's score knows when to swell into urgency and when to retreat into near inaudibility, leaving space for breath, for heartbeat, for the soft rustle of fabric, or the distant echo of footsteps. The famous slowed-down motif drawn from Piaf's voice isn't mere cleverness. It becomes a sonic representation of time stretching under emotional pressure, a lullaby turned dirge that carries both nostalgia and warning. The music never bullies the scene. It waits, it breathes with the characters, it rises only when the feeling has already crested inside them. This restraint turns the score into a kind of co-narrator, one that amplifies what is already present, rather than manufacturing feeling from nothing. In a landscape where soundtracks often compete for attention, Zimmer and Nolan's collaboration stands out for its humility. The music exists to hold space for the actors' faces, their silences, their small trembles, making every note feel earned rather than imposed. Failure and hesitation receive a rare kind of respect here. Most action-driven stories treat doubt as a temporary obstacle to be overcome before the hero charges forward. Inception allows hesitation to linger, to have weight, to shape decisions in ways that aren't always triumphant. Characters pause, second-guess, freeze, not because they are weak, but because the stakes are genuinely unbearable. Nolan grants these moments duration and dignity, a long look before leaping, a hand hovering above a totem without quite touching it. I know whispered admission that the plan might not work. These aren't flaws to be edited out. They are evidence of humanity, proof that the people on screen understand the gravity of what they're attempting. The film suggests that real courage isn't the absence of fear or uncertainty, but the willingness to move through them anyway, to act even when the ground feels unsteady. By giving hesitation room to exist without judgment, Inception quietly expands what strength can look like, less a straight line of conquest and more a series of brave, faltering steps. Ultimately, the movie reveals itself as a secular meditation on impermanence. Everything in its world, dream cities, constructed memories, even the most carefully spun totems, is subject to collapse, to fading, to being overwritten or forgotten. Yet rather than despairing, the film leans into that truth with a kind of tender acceptance. It asks us to love what is temporary without clinging so hard that we crush it, to build meaning knowing the structure won't last forever, to find beauty in the act of creation even when the creation will one day dissolve. This isn't nihilism. It's a gentle realism that finds value precisely because things pass. The characters' journeys circle this same insight. Holding too tightly guarantees loss, while opening the hand allows for something new, imperfect, fleeting, but real, to arrive. The film never forces optimism. It simply shows that letting go can be its own form of grace. If these reflections have settled somewhere soft inside you, if they've made you want to sit again with a particular silence, a particular gesture, or simply the weight of that final unanswered spin, trust that instinct. Carve out the quiet, press play, and let the film find you exactly where you stand today. It has a way of meeting you there, no matter how many times you've walked its halls before. We've already sat with so many of its quiet revelations. Memory as both tender archivist and subtle saboteur that rewrites history to keep us afloat. Forgiveness as slow, uneven acts of unclenching rather than dramatic erasure. Music as humble scaffolding that holds space for breath and tremor rather than drowning out the human voice. The dignity granted to hesitation and faltering steps as proof of real courage rather than obstacles to be hurdled, and the film's tender realism about impermanence that finds grace precisely in the act of releasing what cannot be held forever. Let's ease now into spaces that carry an almost confessional intimacy. The way the movie quietly honors solitude without romanticizing it, portraying isolation as both a necessary refuge and a risk that can calcify into permanence if left unchallenged. The subtle portrayal of hope as something fragile and intermittent rather than a constant flame, flickering in small, almost accidental moments amid the darkness. The film's respect for the body as the last honest witness when the mind has learned to lie to itself, registering truth through racing pulse, shallow breath, or the involuntary tremor of a hand. The understated power of ordinary domestic details, half-eaten meals, scattered papers, a child's drawing pinned to a wall, that anchor the most fantastical sequences in recognizable human texture. And how the entire narrative arc ultimately circles a single, unspoken act of faith, believing that love, even when fractured and half-remembered, can still reach across any divide if only one person is willing to keep reaching back. Solitude in Inception is never villainized as mere weakness or punished as moral failing. It is shown as a natural, sometimes life-saving response to pain too raw for company. Characters retreat into private dream constructions not out of selfishness, but out of sheer survival instinct, building worlds where the rules bend to accommodate what reality refuses to contain. Yet the film watches these retreats with clear-eyed compassion rather than judgment, allowing us to feel both the relief of withdrawal and the slow poison of prolonged isolation. But solitude becomes dangerous only when it hardens into a permanent state, when the refuge turns into a tomb because no one is left to call the inhabitant back to the surface. Nolan never forces reunion as a tidy cure. He shows it as tentative, awkward, sometimes rejected, an outstretched hand that may be taken or ignored. The movie grants solitude its dignity, while gently insisting that no mind, however fortified, is meant to remain sealed forever. Connection, when it finally occurs, arrives not as conquest, but as quiet permission, the simple act of allowing another person to witness the ruins without trying to immediately rebuild them. Hope here is portrayed with rare restraint, never a roaring beacon or unbreakable optimism, but something small, intermittent, and easily extinguished if handled too roughly. It flickers in unexpected places, the brief softening of a guarded expression, the way a character lingers a moment longer than necessary when listening to another's story, the faint upward curve of a mouth that hasn't smiled in what feels like lifetimes. These glimmers aren't triumphant. They are fragile, easily overlooked, and often followed by retreat or doubt. Nolan understands that hope after profound loss doesn't arrive fully formed. It stutters into existence in half steps, falters, disappears for long stretches, then reappears in forms so modest they can be mistaken for coincidence. The film never promises that hope will win. It simply shows that its persistence, however faint, is what keeps the possibility of change alive. By refusing to inflate hope into something heroic or inevitable, Inception makes its appearances feel earned and therefore all the more moving, small sparks in vast darkness that remind us survival itself can be a quiet form of defiance. The body emerges as the film's most reliable truth-teller when every other faculty has learned the art of deception. Minds can construct flawless illusions, memories can be selectively edited, perceptions can be manipulated until reality itself feels negotiable. Yet the body refuses to play along. It betrays through accelerated breathing during moments of suppressed panic, through the involuntary clench of a jaw when a lie is told, through the way fingers tremble when touching something that should feel familiar, but doesn't quite. Nolan shoots these physiological tells in close, unhurried detail, sweat beating at a hairline, a pulse visible at the throat, on the subtle hitch in breathing when a projection draws too near. These are not dramatic flourishes. They are honest signals that something deeper has registered the dissonance, even if the conscious self denies it. The body becomes the last line of defense against self-deception, the part of us that still knows the difference between constructed comfort and lived truth. In a story so concerned with layers of illusion, this return to physicality feels profoundly grounding. A reminder that no matter how elaborate the architecture of the mind, the flesh continues to speak in its own unscripted language. Ordinary domestic details scattered throughout the dream worlds serve as quiet lifelines back to the tangible, human scale of existence. A child's half-finished drawing left on a table, a coffee cup with lipstick still on the rim, but a stack of unopened mail accumulating in a hallway. These aren't mere set dressing. They are deliberate reminders that even in the most surreal, gravity-defying sequences, life once happened in ordinary rooms with ordinary messes. Nolan peppers the impossible with these fragments of the everyday to keep the emotional stakes recognizable. The terror isn't just that cities fold or time dilates, but that someone might lose forever the right to sit at a kitchen table and argue over small, stupid things with the people they love. These details ground the spectacle without diminishing it, turning grand dream cataclysms into metaphors for the smaller, more devastating collapses that happen inside families and inside hearts. They whisper that what we ultimately fight to preserve isn't the grandeur of the dream, but the humble texture of shared, and imperfect days. At its most essential level, the film becomes an extended meditation on the act of reaching, across distance, across time, across the chasm that grief and guilt dig between people. Every major beat returns to this gesture, a hand extended toward someone who may or may not take it, a voice calling a name into silence that might answer or might not, a decision to keep showing up even when the response is uncertain. Love in Inception isn't depicted as invincible or redemptive in any easy sense. It is shown as stubborn, flawed, sometimes clumsy persistence, the willingness to keep reaching even after every previous attempt has failed, to believe that something worth salvaging still exists on the other side of the divide. The movie never guarantees reciprocity, it simply honors the courage it takes to try anyway. That quiet faith in the possibility of reconnection, however faint, becomes the emotional through line that carries everything else, the chases, the collapses, the spinning totems, and leaves us with the sense that, in the end, the most radical thing a person can do is refuse to stop extending the hand. If these thoughts have landed softly somewhere inside you, if they've evoked a memory of your own small reaches, your own moments of faltering hope, or simply the comfort of knowing someone else has sat with the same questions, let that feeling guide you. Find a quiet hour, return to the film, and allow it to sit with you again. It has never demanded anything from us except honest attention, and it rewards that attention with a kind of companionship that few stories manage to sustain. Now, we've already held space for so many of its gentlest truths. Solitude honored as refuge, yet quietly warned against as risk when it hardens into isolation without exit. Hope depicted as fragile flickers rather than unquenchable fire. The body as the final, unfooled witness that registers dissonance through pulse and tremor when every other sense has learned to lie. The scattering of ordinary domestic fragments, half-finished drawings, cooling coffee cups, unopened envelopes, that keep even the wildest dream architecture tethered to lived human texture. And the narrative's deepest current as an extended act of reaching across every kind of divide with the stubborn faith that love, however broken or distant, can still answer if someone refuses to stop calling. Let's settle now into regions that carry an especially intimate hush. The film's reverence for the small rituals we invent to mark time and meaning when the larger clocks of life feel broken. The way it quietly affirms that vulnerability is not weakness, but the precise location where real strength begins to grow. The subtle choreography of absence, empty chairs, unfilled spaces, voices that echo without origin, that turns loss into a visible presence rather than mere void. The movie's refusal to pathologize longing as something to be cured rather than something to be carried with increasing tenderness, and how the entire experience ultimately becomes a kind of secular liturgy for anyone who has ever had to learn how to live with an open wound that refuses to close completely. The small, maybe repeated rituals that characters cling to, spinning a piece of metal on a tabletop, tracing the same path through a remembered room, pausing at the same threshold before stepping forward, serve as quiet anchors when every other measure of time and progress has become unreliable. These are not superstitions to be dismissed. They are deliberate acts of meaning-making in a reality that no longer cooperates with ordinary cause and effect. Nolan grants them gravity without irony. A simple rotation becomes ceremony, a repeated glance at a photograph becomes prayer, the act of checking a familiar weight in the pocket becomes confession. The film understands that when the world inside and outside has fractured, we invent these micro-observances to remind ourselves we still exist in sequence, that yesterday happened, and that tomorrow might still arrive. They are ways of saying I was here, and I am still here, when louder declarations feel impossible. By treating these rituals with respect rather than condescension, Inception offers quiet permission for anyone watching to keep their own small ceremonies without shame. Whatever quiet thing you do to mark the day, to prove continuity, to hold the line against erasure. Vulnerability appears not as a momentary lapse, but as the very ground where transformation becomes possible. Characters are at their most armored when they are most afraid, building layer upon layer of control and distance to keep pain at bay. Yet, the moments that matter most are the ones where armor cracks, when a voice falters, when a hand reaches without certainty it will be met, or when someone admits aloud that they no longer know what is real. Nolan never frames these exposures as defeat. He shows them as the beginning of strength that actually endures. Vulnerability here is not about collapsing, but about refusing to collapse alone, allowing another person to see the fracture lines so they can help hold the structure together until it learns to stand again. The film suggests that real power lies not in invulnerability, but in the courage to be seen in pieces and still choose to keep moving. That perspective feels almost countercultural now, in a time when so much energy goes into curating unbreakable surfaces. Inception quietly reminds us that the places we most fear showing are often the places where the deepest connections take root. Absence is given a physical, an almost architectural presence throughout the film. Empty rooms that still hold the shape of recent occupation, chairs pulled out but never filled again, corridors that echo with footsteps no longer there. Nolan turns these voids into active participants rather than mere background. The camera lingers on unoccupied space long enough for us to feel its weight, to sense the person who should be there but isn't. Absence becomes a form of haunting that is tender rather than terrifying, the lingering outline of a life interrupted, the negative space that still carries warmth from the body that once filled it. This portrayal refuses to treat loss as something that can be filled or erased. Instead, it honors the way the missing person continues to shape the room, the conversation, the story long after they have gone. By giving absence its own visible architecture, the movie allows us to grieve without needing to pretend the gap has closed. It says the wound can scar over and still be felt, that memory can occupy space without needing to be exercised. Longing itself is never diagnosed as illness to be overcome. It is treated as a natural extension of having loved deeply and lost. Characters carry their longing openly, not as weakness to be hidden, but as evidence of what once mattered enough to break them. Nolan refuses easy cures or quick resolutions. He shows longing persisting alongside daily life, fading and flaring without predictable pattern, sometimes quiet for months, then sudden and sharp again. The film grants it dignity by allowing it to coexist with forward motion rather than demanding it be left behind. A longing becomes part of the texture of being human, something to be walked with rather than walked away from, something that can soften over time without ever disappearing entirely. In doing so, Inception offers a rare compassion, permission to miss what is gone without being told you should already be over it, to feel the ache and still choose to keep living in its presence. At its furthest reach, the movie becomes a kind of secular liturgy, a ritual of attention and remembrance for anyone learning to inhabit a world permanently altered by loss. It doesn't promise resurrection or reunion. It offers instead the discipline of showing up to what remains, of noticing the small signs of life that persist amid ruin, of extending the hand again even when the last time it was empty. The film never raises its voice to preach. It simply sits with us in the quiet, mirroring our own halting steps, our own faltering reaches, our own stubborn refusal to let the story end in silence. It says that meaning doesn't require a perfect ending, only the willingness to keep turning the page, to keep spinning the small object, to keep breathing through whatever comes next. If these words have found a soft place to rest, if they've reminded you of your own quiet rituals, your own moments of reaching into absence, or simply the strange comfort of knowing someone else has sat this long with the same questions, let that feeling guide your next step. Return to the film when the moment feels right. Let it accompany you again without expectation. It has always been better at listening than at answering, and sometimes that's exactly what we need. We've already lingered over so many of its softest confidences, the small rituals we craft to prove continuity when time itself has grown unreliable, vulnerability welcomed as the exact soil where lasting strength takes root rather than a crack to be sealed, absence granted its own tangible architecture. So loss never has to pretend to be invisible, longing treated with the dignity of something carried rather than cured, and the entire work quietly functioning as a secular liturgy for learning to inhabit an open wound with patience instead of panic. Let's ease now into still more intimate territory. The film's gentle insistence that doubt is not the enemy of faith, but its necessary companion. The way it portrays rest, not sleep, but true rest, as an act of courage when the mind has forgotten how to pause. The subtle power of names spoken aloud as a form of invocation that can summon or banish entire worlds. The movie's refusal to sentimentalize resilience while still showing it as something ordinary. People manage one reluctant breath at a time, and how the deepest layers of the story ultimately whisper that redemption is never about erasing what was broken, but about learning, slowly and imperfectly, to live beside the breakage without letting it define the whole horizon. Doubt in Inception is never cast as betrayal or moral lapse. It is shown as the honest shadow that follows any serious commitment to reality. Characters question not because they are weak-willed, but because they have seen enough of illusion to know how convincingly it can mimic truth. Nolan allows doubt to breathe, long moments of stillness where a character simply stands. I'm staring at something familiar, yet suddenly suspect, weighing the evidence of their own senses against the fear that those senses have already been compromised. The film never rushes to dispel that uncertainty with reassuring answers. Instead, it lets doubt coexist with action, with love, with the decision to keep moving forward even when certainty remains out of reach. This companionship between doubt and determination feels profoundly adult. It acknowledges that real belief rarely arrives without questions trailing behind it, that faith strong enough to endure has usually been tested in the quiet rooms where no one else can hear the argument. By refusing to treat doubt as something to conquer, Inception offers a rare permission to carry uncertainty as part of the journey rather than as proof you've already failed it. Rest, made in the truest sense, is portrayed as an almost radical choice when the psyche has been trained to vigilance. Characters are exhausted not just physically but existentially, haunted by projections, chased by their own regrets, perpetually scanning for the next layer of deception. Yet the film carves out pockets of genuine pause, a moment sitting on cold stone with nothing required but breathing, a brief lean against a wall while rain falls outside, a shared silence where no explanation is demanded. These are not lazy interludes. They are deliberate acts of reclamation, small rebellions against the compulsion to keep running, to keep building, to keep defending. Nolan shows rest as courage, because it requires trusting that the world won't collapse in the seconds you allow yourself to stop holding it together. The movie never romanticizes exhaustion as noble suffering. It simply recognizes that sometimes the bravest thing is to close your eyes and let someone else keep watch for a while, to accept that you do not have to be awake to every danger in order to survive it. Names, when spoken in this film, carry almost talismanic weight. Spoken softly, hesitantly, or with sudden urgency, they function as invocations that can pull someone back from the edge or summon the full force of memory into the present. A name called across an empty space becomes a lifeline thrown into darkness, a way of insisting that the person still exists, even if they have begun to doubt it themselves. Nolan lingers on these utterances, the way a voice cracks on a syllable, the pause before daring to say it again, the quiet relief when an answer finally returns. Names here are not mere identifiers, they are acts of recognition, of claiming and being claimed, of refusing to let someone dissolve completely into the architecture of grief or illusion. The film understands that saying a name aloud can be a form of resurrection in miniature, bringing the absent back into the room long enough to be seen, heard, touched, even if only for a heartbeat. Resilience is never dressed up as superhuman endurance or unbreakable will. It is shown as something quieter, more stubborn, more ordinary. The decision to stand up one more time after sitting down feels impossible. The choice to speak when silence would be easier. The small act of eating something when grief has stolen appetite. Nolan refuses to glorify suffering as character building or to pretend that pain leaves no permanent mark. Instead, he shows people managing, one reluctant breath after another, not because they are exceptionally strong, but because stopping entirely would mean letting the story end prematurely. Resilience here looks like trembling hands that still reach, voices that crack but still speak, eyes that close in exhaustion yet open again the next morning. It is portrayed as unglamorous labor rather than shining virtue, and that honesty makes it all the more recognizable to anyone who has ever had to keep going when every instinct begged to lie down. At its furthest, most tender reach, the film becomes a quiet teaching on how to live beside breakage, without letting the fracture lines dictate the entire shape of the future. It never promises that the wound will disappear, that the missing will return unchanged, or that the mind will one day forget how to doubt itself. Instead, it offers something humbler and more durable, the possibility of building a life that includes the scar rather than being defined by it, of allowing joy and sorrow to occupy the same rooms without one permanently banishing the other, of learning, slowly, unevenly, with many false starts, that wholeness is not the absence of damage, but the willingness to keep assembling meaning around whatever remains. The story does not end with triumphant music or sweeping vistas. It ends with an image that invites you to decide for yourself whether the turning has stopped or is still in motion, leaving the final interpretation to the person who has walked every step beside the characters. We've already sat with so many of its most private truths, doubt welcomed as the faithful shadow that keeps faith honest rather than something to be banished, rest reclaimed as an act of quiet bravery when vigilance has become the only habit left, names spoken aloud as small invocations capable of pulling someone back from disappearance or summoning the full weight of memory into a single breath. Resilience shown in its plainest form as one more reluctant inhale after another, rather than shining armor, and the deepest teaching that redemption arrives not by erasing fracture, but by learning, patiently, imperfectly, to let the breakage become part of the larger shape without letting it eclipse everything else. Let's settle now into even quieter corners that feel almost too tender to name aloud. The film's gentle recognition that joy, when it returns after long absence, often arrives disguised as ordinary moments rather than fireworks. The way it portrays trust as something rebuilt brick by slow brick rather than restored in a single dramatic gesture. The subtle art of noticing small mercies, the warmth of sunlight on skin after endless rain, the sound of a door closing softly instead of slamming, a voice saying your name without anger, that become lifelines when everything else feels underwater. The movie's refusal to equate healing with forgetting while still showing that memory can soften around the edges without losing its shape, and how the entire narrative arc quietly insists that the opposite of despair is not blind optimism, but the stubborn, daily choice to remain curious about what might still be possible tomorrow. Joy in Inception is never loud or triumphant. No, when it appears, it slips in through side doors. A brief, unguarded laugh shared in the middle of chaos. The way light catches someone's face and makes them look suddenly younger. The simple fact of two people sitting side by side without needing to fill the silence with explanations. Nolan treats these moments with exquisite care. They are not rewards for suffering endured, but accidents of grace, fragile proof that the capacity for lightness has not been permanently extinguished. The film never promises that joy will stay or that it will arrive on schedule. It simply shows that its return is possible, even after years of absence, and that it often wears the plainest clothes. A shared glance, a hand brushing another without intention, the ordinary miracle of waking up and finding the day tolerable. By refusing to inflate joy into something heroic or permanent, Inception makes its appearances feel authentic and therefore deeply moving. Small, stolen pockets of warmth that remind us the heart has not forgotten how to recognize light even when it has spent a long time in shadow. Trust, once shattered, is rebuilt here with the patience of someone laying stones without mortar. Each piece tested for fit, each layer allowed time to settle before the next is placed. Characters do not leap back into blind faith. They approach slowly, watching for signs that the ground will hold this time, asking questions they already half know the answers to, offering small vulnerabilities like test weights, rather than throwing open every door at once. Nolan shows this reconstruction as laborious, uneven. I'm sometimes interrupted by old fears that resurface without warning. There are setbacks, moments when a hand is withdrawn, when a name is spoken too sharply, when silence returns heavier than before. Yet the film never treats these reversals as final defeat. Trust grows in the willingness to try again after retreat, in the choice to leave the door cracked even when instinct screams to bolt it shut. The movie grants this process the dignity of real time. No montage compresses months of tentative steps into seconds. No swelling score announces the moment everything is fixed. Instead, we witness the slow accumulation of small proofs, a promise kept, a secret shared without immediate punishment, a quiet presence that does not demand performance. That patience makes the eventual steadiness feel earned rather than gifted, reminding us that some things worth having must be built with deliberate, unglamorous care. Small mercies are scattered throughout, like unexpected gifts left on a doorstep. The brief warmth of sunlight breaking through clouds after days of gray, The soft click of a latch closing gently instead of a door slamming in anger. The sound of one's own name spoken without accusation or urgency. These are not dramatic turning points. They are barely noticeable breaths of relief that accumulate until the body remembers what ease feels like. Nolan lingers on them without fanfare, a character pausing to feel rain on their face instead of running through it. Another noticing the exact color of late afternoon light on a familiar wall. A third simply sitting still long enough to hear their own heartbeat slow. The film understands that after prolonged siege, mercy rarely arrives wearing a crown. It comes in fragments so modest they can be overlooked if you're still braced for the next blow. Yet these fragments matter precisely because they are small. They teach the nervous system that safety can exist in increments, that the world is not always poised to strike, that there are still moments when nothing terrible happens. By giving these micro-kindnesses their own quiet space on screen, Inception quietly affirms that healing often begins with learning to accept gentleness when it arrives disguised as nothing much at all. Memory, too, is allowed to evolve without being asked to disappear. The film never suggests that true peace requires wiping the slate clean or rewriting the past into something painless. But instead, it shows memory softening around the edges, sharp corners rounding over time, vivid colors fading to sepia without losing their outline, certain details receding while others remain stubbornly clear. This softening is not erasure. It is the mind's way of making room for new days without denying the ones that came before. Characters learn to visit old rooms without being trapped inside them, to touch painful recollections without being burned every time, to let the story of what happened become one chapter rather than the entire book. Nolan grants this gradual shift the same respect he gives every other part of the journey. No rush, no forced epiphany, only the slow permission to remember differently. The movie whispers that holding the past lightly does not mean betraying it. It means trusting that love and loss can coexist in the same heart without one permanently overpowering the other. And at the very center of everything, the film keeps returning us to curiosity as the quietest, most durable form of hope. The refusal to let the question mark disappear even when every answer feels out of reach. Characters keep asking, keep wondering, keep noticing. What if this time is different? What if the next room holds something other than another trap? What if the person standing in front of me is still capable of surprise? This curiosity is never loud or certain. It is the small, persistent voice that says, "and then," when every instinct screams to stop. It is what allows them to open one more door, to extend one more hand, to wait one more moment before turning away. Inception never promises that curiosity will be rewarded with easy miracles, but it shows that its persistence is what keeps possibility alive long after certainty has left the room. In doing so, it leaves us with the gentlest challenge: to remain interested in our own lives even when they have disappointed us, to stay open to the next small turn of events, to believe, against every reason not to, that tomorrow might still contain something worth meeting halfway. We've already shared so many of its most private whispers. Joy slipping in through ordinary cracks rather than arriving on fanfare. Trust rebuilt with the slow patience of someone laying stones without rushing the mortar. Small mercies noticed in sunlight after rain or a door closing softly instead of slamming. Memory allowed to soften at the edges without being asked to vanish. Then curiosity held up as the quietest, most stubborn form of hope when every other certainty has left the room. Let's drift now into spaces that carry an almost confessional stillness. The film's subtle acknowledgement that anger, when it finally surfaces after long suppression, can be a form of grief wearing a different face rather than something to be ashamed of or silenced, the way it portrays waiting, not passive endurance, but active, deliberate patience. As one of the hardest and most sacred forms of love, the quiet dignity it grants to the act of remembering someone exactly as they were rather than as we wish they had been. The movie's refusal to treat forgiveness as a debt owed or a score settled, while still showing it as something that can arrive unbidden and change the air in a room without announcement. And how the deepest current of the story ultimately becomes a meditation on the courage it takes to remain tender toward the world even after it is proven repeatedly that tenderness can hurt. Anger in Inception is never presented as villainous or childish. It is shown as a delayed echo of grief that has been held underwater too long and finally breaks the surface. Characters carry their rage quietly at first, Tight jaws, clipped words, hands that close into fists without quite striking, because they have spent years believing that expressing it would shatter what little remains intact. When anger does emerge, it arrives in waves rather than explosions, a sudden sharp tone, a thrown object that misses its mark, a voice that cracks on the name of the person who caused the wound. Nolan never judges these outbursts as failures of control, and he lets them exist as honest expressions of pain that has nowhere else to go. The film understands that suppressed anger does not disappear. It festers, it shapes dreams into fortresses, it turns projections into adversaries. By allowing anger its moment without turning it into the story's antagonist, Inception offers a rare compassion, permission to feel the heat without being consumed by it, to let the emotion pass through rather than become permanent architecture. Anger here is not the opposite of love. It is often its bruised companion, proof that something mattered enough to wound deeply. Waiting in this film is never passive resignation. It is portrayed as an active, almost muscular form of devotion, the deliberate choice to stay present when every instinct urges flight or attack. Characters wait through collapsing cities, and through layers of dream that stretch time into decades, through silences that feel like judgment. They wait not because they are certain of the outcome, but because they have decided the person on the other side is worth the uncertainty. Nolan shows waiting as labor, the slow tightening and loosening of fingers, the measured breathing that keeps panic at bay, the quiet counting of seconds that have become years in subjective time. This waiting is sacred because it refuses to demand immediate proof. It trusts that something worth salvaging may still emerge if given enough unbroken presence. The film never romanticizes the ache of it. Waiting hurts, it exhausts, it tests every limit. Yet it grants the act profound respect. To wait well is to love without possession, to hold space without filling it with demands, to believe in possibility even when evidence has gone quiet. Remembering someone exactly as they were, flawed, contradictory, human, becomes one of the film's most understated acts of fidelity. Characters resist the temptation to polish memory into something saintly or villainous. They hold on to the full, messy truth, the way a laugh used to catch at the end, the small habits that irritated and charmed in equal measure, the ordinary arguments that now feel precious because they belonged to a shared life. Nolan lingers on these unvarnished recollections, a recalled phrase spoken in irritation rather than tenderness, a gesture that was clumsy rather than graceful, a moment of pettiness that now carries nostalgia simply because it was real. By refusing to sentimentalize the past, the film makes remembrance feel honest and therefore more durable. To remember accurately is to honor the person as they existed, rather than as grief has rewritten them. It is to keep their full humanity alive even when only fragments remain accessible. This fidelity to the unidealized truth becomes its own form of love, one that does not require perfection to endure. Forgiveness, when it finally arrives, often comes without ceremony or declaration. It slips into the room unannounced, a decision to stop replaying the same accusation, a hand that no longer clenches at the mention of a name, a moment when the old story loses its power to dictate the next breath. Nolan never frames forgiveness as a transaction, something owed in exchange for remorse or apology, nor does it require the other person to be present or changed. And it is shown as an internal release, a quiet loosening of the grip on pain that has been carried too long. The film allows this shift to happen gradually and unevenly. Forgiveness may coexist with lingering hurt. It may retreat and return. It may feel incomplete, yet still lighten the load. By refusing to treat forgiveness as a dramatic summit or moral victory, Inception makes it feel attainable and human, something ordinary people manage in small, private increments rather than grand gestures. It arrives not because everything has been resolved, but because carrying the grudge has become heavier than setting it down. And at the heart of it all, the film quietly champions tenderness as an act of courage rather than softness to be exploited. To remain open after betrayal, to choose gentleness when hardness would be easier, and to extend care even when the return is uncertain. These are portrayed as deliberate, sometimes exhausting choices rather than natural defaults. Tenderness here is not naivety. It is a practiced refusal to let past wounds dictate future responses, a willingness to risk being hurt again because closing off entirely would mean closing off to life itself. Nolan shows this tenderness in small strokes, a voice kept low during conflict, a hand offered without expectation, a silence that listens rather than judges. The movie never promises that tenderness will be rewarded or protected. It simply honors those who continue to offer it anyway. In doing so, it leaves us with the gentle challenge to stay soft toward the world even when experience has taught us otherwise, not out of foolishness, but out of a deeper conviction that tenderness is what keeps the possibility of connection alive long after safer paths have closed. We've already shared so many of its most intimate confidences, anger recognized as grief wearing armor, rather than something to be silenced or shamed, waiting honored as active devotion rather than passive surrender, the deliberate choice to remember people in their full, unpolished humanity instead of rewriting them into saints or shadows, forgiveness allowed to arrive without fanfare or ledger, tenderness defended as courage rather than vulnerability to be exploited. Let's ease now into spaces that feel almost too private to speak above a whisper. The film's subtle acknowledgement that shame, when it lingers after the fact, and often roots itself deeper than guilt because it turns inward and whispers that the self is fundamentally unworthy rather than merely mistaken. The way it portrays the slow return of appetite for food, for touch, for ordinary mornings, as one of the quietest signs that life is beginning to reclaim territory once occupied entirely by loss. The understated reverence for the act of noticing beauty in small, unremarkable things, a particular shade of blue in the sky, the texture of worn cotton against skin, the sound of pages turning in a book, as a form of resistance against despair's attempt to gray out the world. The movie's refusal to treat exhaustion as moral failure, while still showing rest as something that must sometimes be fought for rather than simply taken. And how the deepest layer of the story ultimately becomes a gentle reminder that the opposite of being broken is not being whole again, but being willing, day after reluctant day, to let the pieces coexist without forcing them to fit the shape they once had. Shame in Inception is never dramatized as loud self-recrimination or theatrical collapse. It is shown as a quiet, persistent undertow, a voice that speaks only when no one else is listening, insisting that the wound proves something irreparably wrong with the person who carries it. Characters bear this shame in small, almost invisible ways. Averted eyes during conversation, shoulders that stay slightly hunched even in safe rooms, hands that hesitate before touching anything that once brought comfort. Nolan allows shame its full weight without turning it into spectacle. When he shows how it can make even the most capable person feel fraudulent, how it can transform memories of love into evidence of personal failure, how it can convince someone that their presence is a burden rather than a gift. Yet the film never lets shame have the final word. It places small counter moments beside it. A steady gaze returned without flinching, a hand that reaches anyway, a voice that says, "Stay," without needing to explain why. These gestures do not erase shame. They simply create space where it is no longer the only voice in the room. By treating shame as something that can coexist with worthiness rather than disprove it, Inception offers a rare mercy, the understanding that feeling unworthy does not make it true, and that the work of reclaiming dignity often begins with refusing to let the quiet accusation become the only story being told. The slow, hesitant return of appetite, for simple meals eaten without tasting grief in every bite, for the warmth of another person's nearness without immediate panic, for mornings that begin with curiosity rather than dread, becomes one of the film's most understated markers of recovery. These returns are never triumphant. They arrive in fragments so modest they can feel insignificant at the time. Finishing half a cup of tea without setting it aside unfinished, noticing the smell of rain on pavement and feeling something other than numbness, waking up and staying awake long enough to watch light move across a wall. Nolan lingers on these micro-recoveries without commentary, not letting the camera hold on a plate being cleared, a hand lingering on a sleeve, a breath drawn deeper than the one before. The film understands that after profound depletion, the body forgets how to want. Appetite must be gently coaxed back, one small yes at a time. These moments matter precisely because they are ordinary, proof that life is capable of reasserting itself in the places where loss once sat heaviest, that hunger of any kind can return without apology or explanation. Noticing beauty in the small and unremarkable becomes its own quiet form of defiance against the gray fog that grief and shame can cast over everything. Characters begin to register these details almost against their will. The exact way light fractures through a window pane, the soft rasp of wind moving through distant leaves, the particular warmth of wool against cold fingers. These observations are never presented as sudden epiphanies or forced optimism. They are accidental intrusions of color and texture into a world that had gone monochrome. Nolan grants them space without turning them into salvation. A character pauses mid-step to watch a single leaf turn in the air. Another runs a thumb over the worn edge of a book spine. A third simply stands still long enough to hear birds that have always been there but were previously drowned out. The film suggests that beauty does not heal by erasing pain. It heals by reminding the nervous system that the world still contains things worth pausing for, that not every moment must be endured, but some can be met with quiet attention. In doing so, it quietly affirms that noticing is an act of agency, choosing, however briefly, to let something other than sorrow occupy the foreground. Exhaustion is never framed as weakness or laziness. It is shown as the natural consequence of carrying what cannot yet be set down. Characters move through their days with the heavy limbs and slowed thoughts of people who have been running on reserves for too long. Eyes that close for a second longer than a blink. Sentences that trail off mid-thought, steps that land more deliberately than fluidly. Nolan refuses to romanticize this weariness as noble suffering or to shame it as lack of will. Instead, he carves out moments where rest is fought for rather than simply taken. A deliberate decision to sit when standing feels safer. A choice to close the eyes even when the mind races. A quiet request for space without explanation. And these acts require courage because they mean trusting that the world will not punish the pause, that stopping will not cause everything to collapse. The film honors exhaustion by showing how hard-won rest can be, how it must sometimes be defended against the internal voice that insists there is still more to fix, more to prove, more to survive. Rest here is not reward. It is maintenance, a refusal to let depletion become permanent. And at the center of it all, the story keeps circling back to the courage required to let the pieces of a broken life coexist without forcing them into a shape that no longer fits. Wholeness is never depicted as seamless restoration or a return to some pre-fracture state. It is shown as the slow, deliberate work of living with the cracks, learning which ones can be mended, which ones must be lived around, which ones actually let light in once the edges have smoothed. Characters do not emerge polished or unbroken. They emerge changed, carrying the history of what happened in the way they move, the way they speak, the way they hesitate before certain doors. Nolan never promises that the breakage will stop hurting or that the scar will fade to nothing. He simply shows that it is possible to build a life large enough to include the damage without letting it become the only room. That possibility, imperfect, ongoing, sometimes fragile, becomes the film's most enduring gift. The quiet assurance that being cracked does not mean being ruined, that the work of continuing is itself a form of grace. We've already shared so many of its most guarded secrets, shame met with compassion rather than condemnation, so it no longer has to prove unworthiness. The hesitant return of appetite as one of the body's first fragile signals that life is slowly reclaiming ground. The quiet resistance of noticing unremarkable beauty as a way of keeping despair from painting everything gray. Exhaustion honored without romanticization, while rest is shown as something sometimes earned through deliberate defense rather than simply granted. The courage required to let broken pieces coexist without forcing them back into a shape they can no longer hold. Let's breathe now into even more secluded corners that feel almost too close to speak above a murmur. The film's delicate recognition that loneliness, when it settles after long companionship with others or with one's own thoughts, can sometimes be a necessary clearing rather than a punishment to be fled. By the way it portrays the slow relearning of pleasure in small sensory details, the taste of salt on skin after rain, the faint vibration of a voice felt through a wall, the warmth of cloth settling against shoulders, as acts of reclamation rather than indulgence, the understated power of allowing silence to stretch between two people without rushing to fill it with explanation or apology. The movie's refusal to equate moving forward with leaving everything behind while still showing that forward motion can happen even when the past walks beside you step for step. and how the entire arc quietly becomes an invitation to practice radical acceptance. Not of injustice or pain, but of the simple, stubborn fact that what has happened has happened. Oh, and the work now is to live in the same world as that truth without letting it become the only air we breathe. Loneliness in Inception is never reduced to a problem that needs solving or a flaw that needs fixing. It is allowed to exist as a natural season that follows certain kinds of loss or self-reckoning. Characters move through long stretches of solitude not because they have failed at connection, but because the inner landscape has shifted so radically that old proximities no longer fit. Nolan grants these periods duration and dignity. Long takes of someone walking empty corridors, sitting alone at a table set for more than one, staring at a horizon that offers no immediate answer. Loneliness here is sometimes protective, a clearing where the mind can finally hear itself without competing voices, where grief can unfold without witness, where the self can begin to reassemble without external expectation. The film never romanticizes isolation as superior or pure. It simply shows that some seasons require being alone with what hurts most, and that emerging from them does not always mean never returning. Connection, when it reappears, arrives not as rescue, but as gentle overlap, two solitudes briefly touching without one needing to absorb the other. By refusing to treat loneliness as the enemy of love, Inception offers a quiet permission to let solitude have its time without shame, knowing it may be the very space where something truer can begin to grow. The relearning of pleasure through the smallest sensory doorways becomes one of the film's most understated celebrations of survival. And characters rediscover sensation in fragments so modest they almost pass unnoticed. The faint bitterness of coffee held too long on the tongue, the cool slide of water against wrists after days of fevered skin, the soft gave of a pillow that has not been touched in months. These moments are never scored with triumphant music or framed as breakthroughs. They are allowed to arrive quietly, often mid-thought or mid-step, as though the body has decided on its own timetable when it is safe to feel again. Nolan lingers just long enough for us to register the shift, a slight widening of eyes at the taste of something familiar, a breath caught at the texture of wool instead of armor, a hand pausing to feel the grain of wood rather than gripping it for balance. The film understands that after profound numbness, pleasure must be approached sideways, in increments so small they feel almost accidental. These recoveries matter because they prove the nervous system has not forgotten its original language. It simply needed time, safety, and the absence of demand to remember how to speak it again. Silence between people is given its own careful choreography, stretched, held, sometimes tested, but rarely broken prematurely. Characters sit in rooms where words have run dry, letting the quiet expand until it feels almost physical. The soft creak of a chair adjusting weight, the distant tick of a clock that has not been wound in years, the faint rhythm of breathing that slowly begins to synchronize without either person forcing it. Nolan never rushes to fill these spaces with explanation, confession, or reassurance. He trusts the silence to do its own work, allowing unspoken things to settle, or letting unasked questions hover without demanding answers, giving both parties room to decide whether the next word is necessary or whether the quiet itself is enough for now. This reverence for shared stillness feels almost radical in a world that often equates pause with awkwardness. The film suggests that real intimacy can live comfortably in wordlessness, that two people can be close precisely because they no longer need to prove it with language. Moving forward in Inception never requires abandoning the past at the roadside like unwanted baggage. Characters carry what happened with them, memories that flare without warning, habits shaped by old wounds, a certain way of standing that betrays history even when the face stays composed. Yet the film shows motion as possible anyway, one foot placed in front of the other. A door opened despite the pull to turn back. A conversation continued even when every sentence feels borrowed from a previous life. Nolan refuses easy metaphors of leaving behind or starting anew. He shows forward as a direction rather than a clean break, something that happens while the past walks parallel, sometimes close enough to touch, sometimes a few steps behind. The courage lies not in forgetting, but in refusing to let what was dictate what will be, in allowing the story to continue unfolding, even when earlier chapters still cast long shadows. This refusal to equate progress with erasure makes the movement feel honest, and therefore more affecting. A life that includes damage can still choose direction, can still reach towards something that has not yet arrived. And at the very heart of the film lies an invitation to radical acceptance, not a passive surrender to suffering, but a deliberate, breathing agreement with reality as it stands. To accept that what occurred cannot be undone, that certain doors will never reopen the same way, that the shape of the self has changed permanently in places. This acceptance is never portrayed as resignation or defeat. It is shown as the difficult daily practice of saying, "This is what is," without immediately following it with, "and therefore I am ruined." Characters learn to breathe in the same room as their history, to let memories pass through without gripping them or pushing them away, to make choices from the present rather than from the echo of what once was. The film never promises that acceptance will erase pain or restore what was lost. It simply shows that it can create enough space for something else, quiet, tentative, imperfect, to begin growing alongside the hurt. That space becomes the film's most enduring promise, the possibility of living with what cannot be changed while still remaining open to what can. We've already held so many of its most guarded intimacies. Loneliness granted its season as clearing rather than curse, the tentative reawakening of sensory pleasure as the body's own slow vote of confidence in tomorrow, silence between people allowed to stretch its full length without apology or hurry, forward motion permitted even when the past insists on walking parallel. Instead of being left behind, radical acceptance practiced not as surrender, but as the deliberate decision to breathe in the same atmosphere as what cannot be changed. Let's settle now into spaces that carry the kind of stillness that almost hums with its own weight. The film's gentle understanding that ambivalence, holding two opposing truths at once without forcing a winner, can be a mature form of wisdom rather than indecision to be overcome. The way it portrays the gradual return of playfulness, not as childish regression, but as evidence that the spirit has not forgotten how to experiment, even after gravity has pulled everything downward.